You don't gently enter a medieval city, you're claimed by it. Before you even reach the gates, before you see the rooftops squeezed together like gossiping relatives, your nose has already signed the lease. A medieval city announces itself in scent long before sight. Wood smoke, tanneries, livestock, people who believe bathing is suspicious behaviour, and meals that, let's just say they had aromas with ambition. You don't arrive at the city, it arrives at you, mostly through smell. Before we step inside the crowded streets of a medieval city, take a moment to like and subscribe, and tell me in the comments where you're listening from and what time of day you're joining this journey into everyday life in the past. From the moment you approach, you feel the shift. Villages whisper, towns talk, but cities shout. They broadcast life from half a mile away, the clang of hammers, the bleating of animals being very uncooperative about becoming sausages, merchants, warming up their voices like opera singers preparing to argue about onions, and children practicing the ancient art of yelling at absolutely nothing. Rural life has quiet, but cities have density. Density in population, density in buildings, and density in the air itself, which feels like it has opinions about your personal space. As you walk closer, the road swells with traffic. Not orderly traffic. No one in a medieval city has ever moved in a straight line on purpose, but a chaotic migration of carts, pilgrims, apprentices running late, chickens escaping responsibility, and a dog who is clearly in charge of all of this, whether anyone admits it or not. No one here walks calmly. They weave. They maneuver with the kind of instinct usually reserved for schools of fish avoiding sharks. Except here the sharks are wheelbarrows. It's when the walls come into view that the scale hits you. They rise from the earth like stone mountains built by people who absolutely planned on being invaded at some point. They were thick, imposing, and impressive enough to make newcomers think, wow, civilization, before immediately thinking, wait, why do they need this much defence? Beyond the walls, towers spike the sky like exclamation points, announcing things like, this is the church, this is the town hall, and this is a wealthy merchant who wants you to know he's important. And then you pass through the gate. The gate is not just an entrance, it is a threshold into a completely different rhythm of life. The air tightens, sound multiplies. Your senses expand and recoil at the same time. Suddenly you're inside the hive, and every corridor buzzes with purpose. The crowd doesn't simply move, it swirls, folding around you as though the city is inhaled and you are part of the mixture. The first thing you notice is the noise. It has layers, gossip layers, animal layers, argument layers, commerce layers. Blacksmiths hammering, bells ringing, vendors screeching, prices like auctioneers who never learned volume control, and carts rumbling across stones uneven enough to challenge even the most confident ankles. In a medieval city, silence is a myth. Stillness is a rumour. Peace is the thing travellers say they'll find later, after getting directions wrong for the third time. Then your eyes adjust and the scale of humanity becomes overwhelming. People are everywhere, far more than any village could dream of producing without divine intervention. Men hauling goods, women carrying baskets twice their size, apprentices sprinting because someone is always yelling their name, monks drifting with the calm of men who have processed their regrets, nobles trotting on horseback while absolutely refusing to make eye contact with anyone, and travellers like you who clearly underestimated what busy means in the Middle Ages. Every building looks like it's trying to breathe in more space than it has. Timber frames bow, lean, stretch and overlap in what can only be described as collaborative architectural anxiety. Upper floors jut out over the streets like they're leaning down to gossip about the people below. Nothing looks straight, nothing looks symmetrical, but everything looks alive. And the colours. Oh, the colours. People assume the Middle Ages were grey, but cities were loud in every sense. Clothing dyes, bright hats, painted shop signs, banners fluttering from guild halls and market stalls draped in fabrics meant to catch your eye before someone else's. Even the dirt looked vibrant, mostly because it stuck to every pair of shoes entering town. But what truly defines a medieval city's first impression is its velocity. The speed is not modern, but it is constant. People move with intention, even when the intention is unclear to everyone else. A city's pulse is perpetual, a rhythm of footsteps, wheels, shouting, bargaining, bells and doors slamming. You feel as though the city is breathing around you, exhaling warm, crowded air and inhaling newcomers who aren't sure yet if they're overwhelmed or thrilled. You realise, perhaps too late, that medieval cities are not built as places to relax. They are built as machines of human activity. Messy machines, loud machines, occasionally smelly machines, but machines nonetheless. Every person contributes to the hum, willingly or not. If you stand still for too long, someone moves you. If you walk too slowly, someone moves around you. If you walk too fast, someone assumes you've stolen something. So this is the medieval city. Loud, crowded, chaotic, alive, and absolutely unapologetic. It does not greet you politely. It does not ease you in. It engulfs you, overwhelms you, and then, slowly, you begin to understand why people flocked here. Because beneath the noise and smell and chaos lies possibility, not comfort, not peace, possibility. And tomorrow, when the city wakes again, because it never truly sleeps, it will claim someone else the same way it just claimed you. If you want to understand the psychology of medieval city life, you must start with the walls. Nothing shaped the urban mind more than those massive stone rings that wrapped around the city like a protective parent who loved you, trusted you, and also absolutely wanted to know where you were at all times. The walls were magnificent, towering fortifications wide enough for guards to pace, for patrols to march, and in some famously careless cases for children to fall off. They stood as a statement of power and a reminder that everyone outside them might want to ruin your day. But for all their grandeur, they also communicated something quietly unsettling. You live here now, and you're not leaving after dark. From afar, the walls look heroic. Up close, they look permanent, intimidating, heavy, like they were built by people who genuinely believed the apocalypse had their city on speed dial. These walls weren't decoration. They were survival strategy. Raiders, bandits, rival lords. Someone was always out there hoping your city's sheep would become their sheep. So the walls rose higher, thicker, stronger. But the more secure a city felt, the more aware you became of the fact that you were living inside a stone enclosure designed to keep things out, and in the process, it kept you in as well. The walls keep danger out. Also, fresh air. Medieval cities didn't have a come-and-go-as-you-please policy. That was far too modern, too optimistic, too free. Instead, they had gates, massive, fortified, squealing wooden gates operated by men whose job description was essentially decide when the world is allowed to enter. Gates were the bottlenecks of medieval life. Everything passed through them. Merchants, peasants, travellers, livestock, rumours, fear, and once in a while, someone's goat who had absolutely no business being there but went in anyway, because that's what goats do. In daylight, the gates were lively. Arenas of checking, questioning, bargaining, and occasionally arguing about whether your wagon was truly for personal use. Gatekeepers were the TSA of the Middle Ages, suspicious, underpaid, and absolutely convinced you were up to something. They examined carts for contraband, inspected goods for taxes, and asked questions that might determine whether you entered with a smile or turned around with shame. But as evening approached, everything changed. The closing of the gates at dusk was a ritual older than memory. A guard shouted, a bell rang, merchants rushed, apprentices sprinted, travellers panicked, and the heavy doors swung shut with a thud that echoed through the city like a reminder that your freedom now had set hours. Once closed, those gates weren't opening again unless fire, invasion, or miracle demanded it. Being locked out meant sleeping outside with wolves and questionable strangers. Being locked in meant accepting that your city believed the night was more dangerous than anything inside the walls. Inside, curfew took hold. Not that the city became silent, but it became different. Guards patrolled the top of the walls with torches flickering against stone, creating silhouettes that made every shadow look like a potential invasion force. Even if you knew logically that nothing was climbing over the battlements tonight, the walls kept you alert. They whispered the constant reminder that the world beyond them was unpredictable. The walls watch, the gates judge, the curfew commands. Security in medieval cities was not a gentle presence. It was a daily performance. Soldiers stood at checkpoints, watched street corners, and monitored anyone who looked like they were thinking too freely. The entire system functioned on suspicion, not necessarily fair suspicion, but consistent suspicion. Anger a guard and suddenly, "What's your business here?" turned into, "What's really your business here?" in the tone of someone who hasn't trusted another human since childhood. Yet for all their restrictiveness, the walls did something undeniably important. They created a sense of belonging. If you lived inside the walls, you were part of something. You were sheltered, defended, and included in a collective destiny. Outsiders had to earn the privilege of entering. Insiders carried the quiet confidence of people who believed their city was worth protecting. Still, the daily rhythm of gate life made freedom feel conditional. Want to leave at sunrise? Fine. Want to leave 30 minutes after? Too bad. The gatekeepers were eating, praying, gossiping, or all three. Want to leave after curfew? Absolutely not, unless you could magically turn into fog. Those massive doors were not opening again, and even if you begged, bribed, or explained that you really needed to go see someone, the gatekeeper had heard it all before. Living inside walls also meant you lived inside a pressure cooker. Population grew, houses crowded, closer, and tension simmered. People couldn't just wander into the countryside to cool off or get some space. Space was a luxury the walls did not provide. Privacy was an illusion, air circulation was a privilege, and the knowledge that thousands of people were compressed into one compact stone bowl did interesting things to a person's sanity. But there was comfort too. When rumours of bandits circulated, when armies marched nearby, when distant fires lit up the horizon, the walls stood firm. Their strength wasn't just physical, it was emotional. They offered reassurance in stone form, telling the entire city, "You are safe here." Probably. So the walls were both guardians and jailers. The gates were both entrances and deadlines. The curfews were both precautions and reminders that freedom comes second to survival. And as much as medieval people relied on this structure, they never quite stopped noticing its contradictions. The walls protected them, but they also contained them. They promised safety, but demanded obedience. They kept danger out, but unfortunately fresh air as well. In a medieval city, you lived with that tension every day, grateful for the walls, and slightly resentful of how much they loved keeping you inside. The first thing you must understand about medieval streets is that they were not built for convenience, efficiency, logic, pedestrians, animals, carts, or in some cases, reality. They were built for one purpose only: being there. Anything beyond basic existence was a happy accident. Cities grew like spilled soup, messy, unplanned, expanding in whatever direction life sloshed. Roads twisted not because cartographers were poetic, but because cows walked that way 200 years earlier, and the humans just shrugged and said, "Good enough." When the first builders traced the path of the city's streets, their guiding principle was simple: follow the path of least resistance, which usually meant avoiding rocks, roots, and the property of anyone likely to complain loudly. So the streets became crooked, narrow, chaotic. They turned corners so sharply you could meet your past self coming back around. They climbed hills with slopes steep enough to qualify as intimidation. They squeezed between houses that leaned like introverts trying not to touch each other but inevitably failing. And yet these streets were the arteries of city life, just not healthy ones. Because medieval streets had a texture, a personality, a presence. They were never clean, and they were never dry. Mud was their natural state, even during seasons when mud technically shouldn't exist. It didn't matter whether it was summer, winter, or the alleged dryness of early autumn. If you stepped outside, you were stepping into something. Something wet, something sticky, something that wanted to travel home with you. And the mud wasn't just dirt and water. Oh no, mud was optimistic terminology. Medieval street mud was a philosophical concept, a blend of soil, rotting straw, animal droppings, human droppings, spilled goods, crushed vegetables, and whatever tragedy had occurred earlier in the day. If you fall down, the street keeps a piece of you. That was not a warning. It was a guarantee. Walking through the streets required skill. The nimble developed a kind of sideways shuffle. The foolish walked straight. The overconfident wore shoes they regretted immediately. Boots were not footwear. They were survivors. Shoes disappeared into the sludge with the same quiet finality as treasure lost at sea. Parents warned their children not to pick up anything from the gutter, because the gutter was not a place where items went to rest. It was where items went to die. Even raising the streets didn't help much. Cities attempted to build up layers of gravel or planks or stone, only to discover that the streets swallowed improvements like a beast that hadn't been fed. A new layer of paving vanished beneath wagon wheels and winter thaw. Wooden walkways rotted. Stone cracked. Everything sank. The city fought the streets, and the streets enjoyed winning. And if mud were not enough, the streets also served a secondary function: waste disposal. Not official disposal, no medieval city ever said this out loud, but practical disposal. If you had wastewater, kitchen scraps, spoiled ale, or anything else you didn't want in your home, the street would take it. Not cheerfully, but reliably. People simply tossed things out their door or window with the casual confidence of someone who assumed gravity was a cleaning service. Waste travelled downhill toward drains that rarely drained and gutters that acted more like decorative edging. The street became the city's digestive tract, processing everything the population expelled. When the weather turned warm, the odour rose like a seasonal festival. When rain came, everything liquefied into a smooth citywide pudding that no one wanted but everyone waded through. And yet, somehow, despite all this, the streets stayed crowded. They were packed with carts, pack animals, vendors, beggars, children, dogs, cats, chickens, goats, and enough people to ensure you could never walk 5 steps without adjusting your trajectory. Congestion wasn't an inconvenience, it was a lifestyle. Traffic jams formed not because of roadblocks, but because people enjoyed stopping wherever they pleased and having full-volume conversations. A cart would get stuck, a horse would refuse to move, a merchant would argue about prices in the middle of the street. A pig would decide this was its new home and sit down. And there you had it, a total collapse of urban mobility. Pedestrians navigated by instinct, weaving through gaps nobody else could see. The bravest souls walked through the centre of the street. The wisest hugged the edges and prayed. And still, the streets mattered. They were not glamorous, but they were essential. They connected workshops to markets, markets to homes, homes to taverns, taverns to regrettable decisions, and every regrettable decision back to the mess of life itself. They were stages where the daily drama of medieval existence played out. Arguments, sales, celebrations, accidents, reunions, gossip carried on the breeze, and moments when someone lost a shoe to the mud and accepted it as fate. In a medieval city, the street wasn't just something you walked on. It was something you endured, something you negotiated, something you survived. It shaped the rhythm of life because it slowed everything down, forced people together, and reminded everyone, daily, that civilization is only ever a thin layer built atop chaos. And sometimes, that thin layer was 6 inches deep and squelched when you stepped in it. But despite their flaws, despite the unpredictability, despite the deep and personal relationship between mud and misery, medieval streets held the city together. They were proof that humanity could build thriving communities even when the ground beneath them was actively trying to sabotage the experience. You didn't stroll through these streets, you lived through them, and each step added a little something new to your shoes, your patience, or your understanding of city life. And yes, if you fell, the street did keep a piece of you. But if you stayed long enough, you kept a piece of the street too. The medieval city wasn't just crowded with people, it was crowded with buildings, all standing shoulder to shoulder like relatives forced into a family photo, each one leaning at a slightly concerning angle. These houses did not stand upright so much as negotiate with gravity. The architecture of the medieval city can best be described as, we're doing our best with what we have, and what we have is wood, nails, hope, and a prayer. Timber-framed houses were everywhere. Wood was the construction material of choice because it was accessible, workable, and easy to stack into something that looked vaguely like a home. The downside, wood has opinions. Wood shifts, warps, swells, contracts, and reacts dramatically to weather changes. A few rainy seasons, a bit of settling, a few dozen years of families stomping around, and suddenly your house is leaning like it's whispering gossip to the neighbour's roof. The buildings often tilted inward toward the street or toward each other, forming corridors that felt less like deliberate urban design and more like two exhausted giants slowly falling asleep. Some looked as though they were bowing for applause. Others looked like they were moments away from taking a nap on the building next door. It's not that collapse was common, it's that it wasn't unheard of. Your house doesn't collapse often, just enough to stay exciting. Inside, the architecture didn't get any more reassuring. Floors sloped, door frames weren't properly aligned, ceilings dipped. If you placed a ball on the floor, it might roll away to a part of the house you didn't know existed. Guests learned quickly that balance was optional, but flexibility was essential. A medieval home was a workout routine disguised as shelter, and the houses weren't just leaning, they were stacking. Medieval cities lacked the space to expand outward, so they expanded upward. Upper floors jutted out over the street, giving the buildings a layered look, narrow at the base, wide in the middle, widest at the top. This design saved ground space and allowed for larger living quarters, but anyone walking below felt like they were passing under a shelf that could fall at any moment. It was architectural ambition mixed with structural anxiety, crowding forced buildings into tight grids, sometimes with only inches between them. Neighbours could open their upstairs windows and shake hands, or argue, or trade gossip, or pass a forgotten cooking pot from one home to the next, without ever stepping outside. Privacy was not a concept medieval housing prioritised. If you could hear your neighbours breathing through the wall, congratulations, you lived in a structurally typical home. But while the density made living convenient in some ways, it created a nightmare in others. And the biggest danger, greater than collapse, greater than bad construction, greater even than mould that deserved its own tenancy, was fire. Medieval cities were fire traps waiting for someone to sneeze too close to a candle. With so many timber-framed houses packed tightly together, one spark could turn into a city-wide disaster in a matter of minutes. Open flames were everywhere. Hearths, torches, lamps, forges, ovens, candles in windows, cooking fires that didn't understand boundaries. A medieval city at night looked peaceful, but it smelled faintly of possible catastrophe. Fire regulations existed, of course, but mostly in the form of advice like, please don't burn down the city, which, historically speaking, was only moderately effective. Bucket brigades were organised. Neighbours lined up to pass water hand to hand, hoping to stop flames before they spread. But medieval homes were not modest in their ability to burn quickly. Dry timber, thatch, resin, and cramped alleys created the perfect recipe for disaster. Sometimes cities tried to mitigate the risk with stone or tile, especially for wealthier homes. But for most people, fire wasn't an if, it was a when. Residents lived with the constant awareness that their home could become a bonfire with walls. They slept lightly, they watched chimneys suspiciously, they avoided cooking on windy days, and when they heard the distant sound of shouting and bells, They hoped desperately that it was gossip and not flames. The houses also held another danger: structural improvisation. Because medieval populations grew unpredictably, builders frequently modified existing homes on the fly. Add a room here, extend a floorboard there, wedge a staircase into a corner that clearly wasn't designed for one. Over time, these additions gave homes the chaotic charm of something built by a committee that never met. But despite their flaws, medieval houses were also deeply personal spaces. They were full of life: children racing upstairs, parents cooking over the hearth, apprentices sleeping in corners, animals wandering in and out like furry roommates who never paid rent. Homes were hubs of family, trade, and survival. A house wasn't just a building. It was proof you belonged to the city. They were also symbols of status. A wealthy merchant's home towered above the street with decorative beams and windows that actually opened, while a poor labourer's dwelling might be a single room with a ceiling low enough to challenge anyone taller than average. But whether grand or humble, every house had a personality, usually eccentric, sometimes alarming, always memorable. And so the medieval city became a forest of wooden dreams and structural compromises, homes that leaned but held, walls that creaked but stood, floors that wobbled but endured, buildings that looked like they survived through pure stubbornness. They were imperfect, precarious, and occasionally dangerous, but they were home. In a world without architects on speed dial or city inspectors carrying clipboards, you simply trusted your house. You trusted the beams. You trusted the nails. You trusted that gravity hadn't made any new plans, and most days it worked out. Privacy in a medieval city was not a right, not a privilege, not even a rumour. It was a mythical creature, something people talked about vaguely, like dragons or clean streets, but almost no one had actually seen. Life was lived so closely, so tightly, so intimately pressed together that your neighbours weren't just neighbours. They were an extension of your daily soundtrack. You don't wonder how your neighbours are doing. You already know. Houses shared walls that were thinner than the average secret. Entire. Families lived in adjoining structures that seemed specifically engineered to broadcast every sneeze, argument, whispered conspiracy, and late-night stomach growl. If someone 2 doors down rolled over in bed, you might hear the mattress ropes creak. If someone next door sighed deeply, you could usually guess why. And if someone was trying to have a private conversation, good luck. The walls transmitted drama more efficiently than any messenger service ever invented. The closeness wasn't limited to noise. It was physical, spatial, emotional. Medieval cities were built on the principle of maximizing land by minimizing space. Homes hugged each other, workshops spilled into alleys, and the alleyways narrowed until 2 grown adults passing each other had to negotiate rights of way like diplomats. Streets were busy, homes were busier. There was no such thing as alone time. There was only less crowded than usual. And so, people adapted. Communal living wasn't merely cultural, it was necessary for survival. Families didn't just live together, they lived on top of one another. One room served as bedroom, kitchen, dining hall, workshop, storage, nursery, and occasionally a stage for arguments performed before a very captive audience. Beds were shared, tables were shared, tools were shared, even the air felt shared, thin, warm, and always heavy with the smell of daily life happening a few inches from your face. Children grew up surrounded by voices. Every lesson they learned about adulthood came not from tutors or books, but from listening to the constant human hum through the walls. They learned who argued most, who cooked best, who was late for work, who snored, who lied, and who had no idea how loud their footsteps were at dawn. A medieval child didn't need to ask questions about the world. They heard every detail before breakfast. And oh, the sounds. Cities were dense, but the real density existed inside homes. You heard the scrape of spoons, the shuffle of feet, the clatter of tools, the muttered prayers, the sudden burst of laughter, the not-so-sudden bursts of disagreement, and the domestic symphony of people trying and failing to be quiet. A medieval household was never truly asleep. It simply lowered its volume. But sound wasn't the only intruder. Smells travelled too. Cooking aromas seeped through the cracks between boards. A neighbour baking bread meant your home smelled heavenly. A neighbour boiling cabbage meant you briefly reconsidered living indoors. Smoke drifted from hearth to hearth. Perfumes mingled with sweat. Herbal remedies floated between rooms. You didn't choose what scents you lived with. The neighbourhood chose for you. Space was precious, but community was abundant. With so many people so close, relationships formed at high speed. You knew your neighbours' routines better than your own. You knew when the family upstairs woke, when the couple beside you argued, when the apprentice across the hall practiced singing, poorly, and when the widower downstairs tried to fix something and accidentally broke 3 other things in the process. This intimacy forged bonds. People relied on each other because relying on the walls for soundproofing was not an option. If your child fell ill, the neighbour brought herbs. If you burned supper, someone handed you leftover broth. If you needed help carrying goods, fixing a roof beam, or sorting through a confusing legal issue, someone was already knocking on the door, offering advice you didn't always ask for but usually needed anyway. Communal living also meant communal responsibility. If a fire broke out, everyone sprang into action, not because they were selfless heroes, but because if one house burned, the whole street might burn too. If someone shouted for help, the neighbourhood responded instantly. Everyone had a vested interest in everyone else's stability. Privacy was sacrificed, but safety was shared. Life spilled into the streets as well. Families sat outside to work or talk, sharing updates that quickly became everyone's updates. A conversation wasn't private unless you whispered, and even then, someone with suspiciously good hearing might still catch the important parts. Gossip moved faster than disease, and without the courtesy of an incubation period. Shared walls also created shared tempers. Minor disputes were inevitable. Too much noise, too little noise, someone's child being too energetic, someone's goat being too free-spirited, someone singing past a socially acceptable hour. But fights rarely lasted. When you live inches away from the person you're angry at, prolonged feuds are impractical. You will see them again, in the morning, when the kettle boils loudly enough for both of you to hear, and yet despite the closeness, despite the smells, the noise, the arguments, the lack of boundaries, this communal intensity produced something modern cities often lack: interdependence. People weren't isolated, they weren't strangers, they weren't sealed behind silent walls and locked doors. They were part of a living, breathing network of humanity, connected by proximity, necessity, and the sheer fact that you could hear someone sneeze through a plaster wall. This closeness created resilience. When hard times came, illness, shortage, bad harvest, political upheaval, neighbours leaned on each other. They shared what little they had. They survived together. The city was crowded, yes, but it was also cohesive. People knew one another. People recognised one another. People understood that the line between my problem and your problem was often thinner than the walls between their homes. So no, privacy wasn't something medieval city dwellers enjoyed, but community that they had in abundance. Their lives intertwined so tightly that solitude became an exotic fantasy. The medieval market was not visited, it was survived. It was the roaring heart of the city, pumping goods, gossip, money, and mayhem through every street and alleyway. If the walls protected the city and the houses sheltered it, the market fed it, loudly, chaotically, and with the subtlety of a brass band falling down a staircase. The moment you stepped into the marketplace, you accepted one simple truth. If you're not yelling, you're losing money. Markets were scheduled on specific days, but the city had a funny interpretation of the word day. The stalls didn't politely open at sunrise. They exploded into life as soon as vendors stumbled out of bed. Before the sun fully climbed the horizon, the square was already a battlefield of canvas booths, wooden tables, tilting carts, and merchants staking claims with the territorial confidence of wolves marking a forest. Goods arrived from everywhere. Farmers trudged in from the countryside with wagons of vegetables, produce, eggs, cheese, and anything that hadn't been eaten by weather, pests, or their own livestock. Traders hauled sacks of grain, spices, salt, and dried fish. Artisans carried their crafts, metal tools, leather goods, pots, wooden bowls, combs, shoes, candles, ropes, objects vital for daily survival, or for making daily survival feel slightly less tedious. And then there were the specialty merchants, the ones selling perfumes that fought valiantly against the city's natural bouquet, charms carved from bone, ribbons dyed in colours bright enough to scare birds, and remedies that cured everything except skepticism. These vendors made the market feel almost magical, provided you didn't look too closely at the ingredients. The noise was unbelievable. Every vendor had a voice specifically engineered to rise above the others. Merchants shouted prices like carnival barkers. Fishmongers hollered about freshness, with the desperation of men who knew their product had about 6 hours left. Bakers bragged about bread so loudly that customers wondered if it came with an ego. Bargaining wasn't just acceptable, it was expected. And it wasn't polite bargaining, it was combat bargaining. Every sale was a duel fought with decibels. If you're not yelling, you're losing money. The volume wasn't just about attracting buyers, it was also a form of defence. If a rival vendor began shouting louder, customers naturally drifted toward the sound like moths to a flame. Silence meant surrender. Muttering meant bankruptcy. Whispering meant you were selling illegal goods or had given up on capitalism entirely. But woven into this chaos was the remarkable efficiency of a medieval economy. Buyers moved through the crowd with purpose. Housewives inspected produce with the same scrutiny a blacksmith used when choosing tools. Apprentices fetched supplies for their masters. Children begged for scraps or tried to sneak a berry while their parents weren't looking. Travellers wandered with wide eyes, overwhelmed yet fascinated by the noisy ballet of commerce. And then came the smells, the uninvited chorus accompanying the symphony of voices. Fresh bread teased from one direction. Strong cheese announced itself from another. Meat roasted over a pit, filling the air with mouth-watering smoke. Nearby, the fish stall contributed. Something less mouth-watering. Spices floated in warm breezes. Cinnamon, pepper, saffron, blending with the earthy scent of vegetables and the unpredictable fragrances of livestock milling around. The market was a sensory education in economics and biology. The ground underfoot was no help whatsoever. Straw, sawdust, crushed leaves, spilled grain, and something that looked suspiciously like yesterday's cabbage stew combined into a terrain that challenged even the most sure-footed. People manoeuvred around puddles, debris, and the occasional chicken who believed it owned the road. A dropped apple didn't bounce. It simply disappeared into the marketplace floor with a quiet goodbye. But despite the chaos, the market was an economic marvel. It gathered everything the city produced and everything the city needed into one central hub. It was here that you learned the price of survival. Want bread today? Hope you have coins, or at least something worth bartering. Need shoes repaired? The cobbler is right beside the knife sharpener, who is right beside the tanner, who is right beside someone who definitely shouldn't be selling meat in this heat. Prices fluctuated wildly. A sudden storm made vegetables expensive. A good fishing week made seafood cheaper, but also made half the square smell like the ocean at low tide. A rumour of conflict raised the price of salt instantly. Economics in a medieval market was less like a system and more like a mood. And oh, the characters you met. The vendor who swore his apples cured melancholy. The cloth merchant who insisted his fabrics were from faraway lands, even though the loom marks gave them away. The butcher who used charm as effectively as his cleaver. The spice seller who whispered mystical nonsense just convincing enough to separate you from your money. Buying wasn't merely a transaction, it was a performance. You complimented goods you didn't want. You pretended to leave to get a better deal. You walked away dramatically, hoping the merchant shouted after you. Half of bargaining was theatre, the other half was stamina. But the market was more than commerce. It was news. If something happened in the city, the market heard it first. Rumours circulated faster here than anywhere else. Announcements were made, decrees were read. Strangers shared stories from distant towns. It was the social media of the Middle Ages, no privacy settings included. For many, the market was the highlight of the week, a place to see faces, greet friends, complain about prices, admire crafts, and ensure the city still felt alive. It was crowded, noisy, overwhelming, and sometimes smelled like regret, but it was the beating heart of medieval urban life. By the time you left, arms full, purse lighter, ears ringing, you understood why the market mattered. It wasn't just where goods were sold, it was where the city reaffirmed itself, loudly and proudly. In a medieval market, silence meant defeat, yelling meant profit, and survival meant learning the art of doing both simultaneously. In a medieval city, meals were not emotional experiences. No one sat down, sighed deeply and said, "Ah, yes, this stew brings me joy." Joy was not on the menu. Survival was. Food existed to keep you upright, conscious, and capable of doing whatever exhausting task your day demanded. Food doesn't make you happy, it keeps you functional. And sometimes, barely. Urban diets were shaped by two forces, availability and necessity. Most people didn't get to choose what they ate. They got to accept what existed. The countryside could rely on gardens and small livestock, but the city had to feed tens of thousands of people crammed behind stone walls. This meant the staples dominated every meal, every season, every social class. Bread, pottage, ale, bread, pottage, ale. Repeat until mortality. Let's start with bread, the undisputed king of the medieval urban stomach. Bread wasn't a food, it was a lifestyle. It appeared at every meal, regardless of class, from the wealthiest merchant to the poorest labourer. But not all bread was equal. The rich might have fine white loaves made from wheat, light, and soft enough to feel luxurious. The poor ate darker, denser bread made from rye, barley, oats, or whatever grain hadn't been carried off by mice. And then there was really poor bread, the kind padded with cheaper ingredients like peas, beans, bran, or sawdust. Adjacent fillers that were technically edible but spiritually discouraging. Bread wasn't supposed to crumble like sand, but medieval bakers had a talent for testing the limits of human jaw strength. Still, bread was bread. It provided. Calories. It stopped hunger. It encouraged your stomach to stop complaining loudly enough for your neighbours to hear through thin walls. But bread had a shadow side. It depended entirely on grain supply. One bad harvest, one disrupted trade route, one greedy official, and suddenly the entire city was in crisis. Grain prices skyrocketed with the enthusiasm of a market obsessed with misery. People lined up hoping for a loaf, any loaf, even the kind that tasted like disappointment and dust. Bread riots broke out when scarcity hit. Proof that humans will tolerate many things but not empty carb shelves. Then there was pottage, the great equalizer of medieval cuisine. Neither soup nor stew, but a durable mix of whatever grains, vegetables, and occasional scraps found their way into the pot. Pottage simmered all day over the hearth, thickening into a consistency that varied between solid and architectural. A well-made pottage could be nutritious. A poorly made one could double as mortar. Its ingredients changed constantly. Onions if you had them, beans if you were lucky, herbs if they hadn't wilted yet, a few carrot shavings if your neighbour owed you a favour. Meat was a rare gift unless you could afford it, or had extremely generous butchers nearby. The flavour profile of pottage ranged from surprisingly decent to what emotion is this supposed to taste like? But no matter how it tasted, it got the job done. It filled stomachs, it stretched ingredients, it kept energy levels high enough for work, walking, worrying, worshipping, and whatever else the city demanded. And of course, ale. Medieval ale wasn't a recreational drink, it was a hydration strategy. Water was risky in cities, where wells and streams were reliable only in their inconsistency. Ale, however, was boiled during brewing, making it safer to drink. It was mildly alcoholic, enough to cleanse but not enough to incapacitate, unless consumed with heroic enthusiasm. Everyone drank. Adults, workers, apprentices, even children. The goal wasn't intoxication. It was not dying of dysentery. Alehouses dotted the city like rest stops for tired souls. People gathered for news, warmth, and the eternal comfort of a drink that wouldn't send them to the healer by morning. But ale had its drawbacks, namely the after-effects of consuming only fermented grain products for hydration. Medieval digestion was, in a word, traumatic. Protein was scarce for most city dwellers. Meat was expensive, and when purchased, nothing went to waste. Bones became broth. Organs became mystery pies. Fat became cooking fuel. Fish was more accessible, but freshness varied, especially on warm market days when the smell told you exactly how many hours it had been since the catch left the river. Eggs were valuable but inconsistent. Cheese was common but aged in ways that modern consumers might classify as hazardous curiosity. Vegetables were consumed when available, but they lacked the diversity of modern diets. Cabbage, leeks, onions, turnips. Functional, practical, sometimes pungent enough to clear sinuses. Fruit existed, but most of it was seasonal and went quickly from ripe to fermented to regrettable. And then there were shortages, which hovered over the city like a permanent cloud. When supplies dwindled, meals shrank. Bread was stretched thinner, pottage grew more watery, ale was brewed weaker. Hunger became a quiet companion. People hid food, hoarded grain, and watered down everything they could. Survival became a skill rather than a guarantee. Still, medieval city dwellers were resourceful. They scavenged edible greens, preserved food in salt or vinegar, dried what they could, and learned to cook creatively within limitations. A good cook was not judged by flavour, but by the ability to make a meal appear out of almost nothing. Food did not comfort. It sustained. It didn't match your tastes. It disciplined them. Each meal reminded you that living in a medieval city meant trading culinary joy for basic endurance. And yet people celebrated when they could. Festivals, feasts, weddings, moments when abundance briefly replaced scarcity, and tables overflowed with roast meats, pastries, fruit, and wine. These were rare, precious glimpses of what happiness could taste like. In a medieval city, water was not something you consumed with confidence. It was something you approached with caution, suspicion, and the quiet hope that today would not be the day your luck ran out. Clean water wasn't a guarantee. It was an aspiration, a rumour, a pleasant theory unsupported by evidence. You don't drink water, you negotiate with it. And the water did most of the negotiating. The problem began with population density. Thousands of people lived inside walls built for a much smaller population. Waste accumulated faster than city infrastructure could handle. Wells, streams and rivers, the lifelines of the urban ecosystem, sat dangerously close to contamination sources. And contamination sources were everything. Tanneries, cesspits, butchers' scraps, dye workshops, fish markets, discarded chamber pot contents, and whatever tragic mixture collected in the streets after rain. So every day the city's residents faced the same question. Where do we get water that won't immediately betray us? Wells. Helpful. Until they weren't. Wells were the heart of urban hydration. Deep stone-lined pits dug with extraordinary effort and maintained with extraordinary hope. If placed correctly, they offered relatively clean groundwater. If placed incorrectly, they offered a slow, steady blend of minerals, runoff, refuse, and whatever misfortune had seeped into the soil that week. Urban planners tried to space wells away from cesspits and waste heaps, But medieval cities expanded unpredictably. A well that was safe in 1180 might be dangerously close to 4 new houses, a pigsty, and someone's suspiciously large refuse pile by 1210. The city shifted and the water shifted with it, downward. Fetching water meant waiting in line. Neighbours gathered with buckets, jugs, barrels, and gossip. Wells were community hubs, but not cheerful ones. People talked in hushed tones about the changes they noticed. The water's murkier this week, or it tastes more assertive, or I'm sure it didn't smell like this yesterday. But complaining didn't help. The well was still the well, and every bucket pulled up felt like a gamble. Clear didn't guarantee clean. Cloudy didn't guarantee deadly. Sometimes you just drank, stared into the middle distance, and waited to see if your stomach filed a complaint. Rivers, the city's friend and enemy. Most medieval cities were built near rivers for obvious reasons: transportation, trade, fishing, and water supply. But rivers were also the city's most abused family member. Every craft, trade, and household dumped waste into the current with the casual confidence of people who believed the river will take it away was a sustainable sanitation policy. Upstream was a blessing, downstream was a curse, and in a crowded city, you rarely knew which parts of the river counted as upstream anymore. Washerwomen beat clothes on rocks while tanners soaked hides a few yards away. Children played in the shallows next to where butchers rinsed blood into the current. The river was many things: marketplace, playground, sewer, fishery, but it was rarely safe. Yet people still fetched water from it, especially when wells ran low or when the bucket line felt like punishment. They filled pails from the riverbank, careful not to disturb whatever floated nearby, then carried it home to boil it. Boiling helped, but not always enough. Some dissolved horrors were simply immune to heat and would politely reintroduce themselves to your digestive system later. Rainwater, a gift with conditions. Rainwater was the medieval city's purest offering, at least until it hit a roof. A sudden storm meant buckets rushed outside, barrels rolled into place, and people briefly felt like nature had forgiven them. Rainwater was soft, fresh, and mostly uncontaminated. But roofs were not. Thatch shed dirt, tiles shed dust, birds shed other things. Water ran off wood treated with resins, off chimneys coated in soot, off rafters where cats like to nap. By the time it reached the barrel, rainwater was still safer than most options, but still required the kind of optimism only a medieval resident possessed. Public fountains, occasional miracles. Some advanced cities built public fountains or aqueduct-fed cisterns. These were civic marvels, stone basins distributing water from sources outside the walls. They reduced dependence on wells and rivers and, when well maintained, which varied, delivered cleaner water than most residents dreamed of. But fountains had their own problems. Pipes clogged. Water pressure failed. The supply stopped abruptly whenever soldiers decided that cutting aqueducts was an excellent siege strategy. And even when running smoothly, the fountains sat in busy squares where animals passed, children played, beggars washed, and vendors rinsed their goods. A fountain might be clean at dawn and questionable by noon. Boiling, filtering, and hoping water treatment was simple. Boil it, strain it, pray. People filtered water through cloth to remove debris. They used sand or charcoal in makeshift filters. They stored water so sediment could settle. Boiling was common, especially before brewing ale or cooking pottage. But these methods weren't foolproof. And so, the medieval stomach did far more heavy lifting than the medieval water supply. Illness was common. Chronic stomach issues were practically a personality trait. Healers recommended herbs, tonics, and occasionally despair. And yet, people survived. Despite the risks, water remained unavoidable. It cooked food, brewed ale, cleaned tools, washed laundry, mixed mortar, cooled forges, and gave families something to argue about while filling buckets. People adapted by developing instincts. Avoid water that looks alive. Avoid water that smells emotional. Avoid water that moves strangely. avoid water that comes from anywhere near the tannery. They trusted their senses, their neighbours, and sometimes dumb luck. And so, daily life required not a glass of water, but courage. Sanitation in a medieval city was a magnificent illusion, an impressive performance of effort without the inconvenience of effectiveness. People talked about cleanliness, wrote rules about cleanliness, even hired people whose job was cleanliness, and yet the streets looked like civilization had taken a vacation and never returned. The city has sanitation, it just doesn't have results. To understand medieval sanitation, you must first understand cesspits, those quiet, ominous holes beneath homes and courtyards where waste was dutifully deposited and then politely ignored. Our cesspit was a simple concept. Dig a deep pit, line it with stone or nothing at all, and hope the contents stayed where they belonged. They rarely did. Over time, cesspits filled, as pits full of waste tend to do. A practical city would have installed a sewage system. A medieval city hired gong farmers, unfortunate souls tasked with climbing into the pit, removing the contents with buckets, and hauling it away in the dead of night. It was the night shift from hell. The job paid well, but at a social cost no amount of coin could fully mend. People avoided gong farmers not out of cruelty, but out of instinct, an instinct that screamed, "Whatever is on that man is trying to get on me." But cesspits were only one part of the sanitation tapestry. The other, darker part involved the streets. Streets, in medieval logic, solved every problem. Need a place to throw wastewater? Street. Need to dump kitchen scraps? Street. Need to discard the bucket you didn't want to empty into the cesspit? Street. Need somewhere for the butcher to release yesterday's decisions? Street. City ordinances technically existed. They ordered citizens not to throw waste from windows. They declared that pigs should not roam freely. They established fines for dumping refuse in public. These regulations were beautifully written, admirably intentioned, and almost entirely ignored. Humans did what was convenient. Convenience said, the window is right there. The street is right below. Problem solved. Chamber pots were emptied with the casual confidence of people who trusted gravity to take care of the details. Some households had the courtesy to shout warnings before pouring. Others did not. Travellers learned quickly. Hug the walls, watch the windows, and assume every open shutter was preparing an unwelcome surprise. The city lived in a permanent state of alertness, not because of crime or war, but because you could be hit by airborne filth at any moment. Animal waste added to the symphony. Horses, oxen, donkeys, goats, dogs. Every creature contributed generously to the urban landscape. The city employed street sweepers, but sweepers could not sweep as fast as animals could poop. The result was an ever-evolving terrain that changed with the weather. Dry days baked smells into the air. Wet days turned the streets into fragrant stew. Snow simply preserved everything for spring when it thawed into a festival of regret. Markets amplified the problem. Food stalls produced scraps and spills. Fishmongers discarded unwanted pieces. Tanners rinsed hides, not caring where the runoff went. No one wanted waste in their home, which meant it ended up in the communal environment instead. A medieval city was not just a place, it was a collaborative project, and unfortunately, one of the things people collaborated on most enthusiastically was garbage. Public latrines existed in some cities, large communal structures built over rivers or pits. They were practical, often free to use, and smelled like a warning from God. People who used them did so quickly. People who didn't use them had their reasons, usually involving dignity and the fear of rats with questionable attitudes. Rivers too bore the burden of sanitation. They carried away refuse, sewage, and whatever the city didn't want to contemplate. The problem, of course, was that rivers also served as water sources, transportation routes, and beloved public gathering spaces. Children played near the banks, washerwomen worked in the shallows, and fishermen pulled dinner from the same place tanners dumped wastewater. The river didn't judge. It simply transported evidence of urban life downstream to become someone else's problem. Disease spread easily in these conditions. Medieval people didn't understand bacteria, but they understood patterns. Bad smells often meant sickness. This belief, though scientifically incomplete, wasn't entirely wrong. But without knowing why danger lurked, sanitation efforts were misguided. People scattered herbs, burned incense, carried flowers, and hung branches over doorways, not because they cleaned the air, but because they made the stench more bearable. And yet, for all the chaos, the city made attempts at improvement. Periodically, officials called for street cleaning days. Fines were issued. Public workers removed waste in carts. Regulations against dumping were repeated until everyone could recite them by heart, while continuing to ignore them. Some cities introduced designated refuse pits or hired crews to transport garbage outside the walls. Progress was slow, inconsistent, and always outpaced by the sheer volume of human activity. Still, medieval residents accepted the environment. They navigated filth with practiced grace, stepping over suspicious puddles, avoiding gutters after rain, and learning which alleys were best avoided entirely. They adapted, endured, improvised, and they maintained a sense of humour about it, because humour was the only defence against the undeniable truth. In a medieval city, work didn't simply begin early. It began before early. It began at a time of day modern people only encounter through nightmares and airport departures. As the sky barely shifted from black to charcoal grey, the city was already stirring, workers shouldering tools, apprentices rubbing sleep from their eyes, merchants unlocking shutters, bakers firing ovens, and every rooster urgently screaming as if the sun required verbal encouragement. For the urban worker, dawn wasn't a beautiful moment. It was an alarm clock with consequences. There was always something to do, something to repair, something to lift, something to stitch, something to haul, something to carry, something to carve, something to hammer, something to sweep, something to dye, something to sell, or something to pretend you were already working on when the master walked in. Your job doesn't burn calories, it consumes you. The city of endless trades. Medieval cities thrived because of specialization. Every craft had its practitioners, labourers whose skill kept the city functional and whose exhaustion kept the city humble. Blacksmiths woke earliest because iron didn't heat itself. They spent mornings covered in soot, afternoons covered in sweat, and evenings covered in regret. Their arms were the size of tree trunks. Their backs gave up on structural integrity around age 30. Weavers spent their days surrounded by looms that clicked, clacked, snapped, and engineered the kind of rhythmic torture that lived in the mind for hours after the shop closed. Weaving wasn't peaceful. It was a marathon of patience and stamina. Tanners endured work that smelled like career-long punishment. They transformed animal hides into leather by soaking them in various unmentionable substances. Tanners went home smelling so strong that even dogs gave them space out of respect or fear. Bakers had the rhythm of monks and the stress of surgeons. Bread fed the city, and bread demanded sacrifice. Dough was mixed before dawn, ovens heated non-stop, and the pace never slowed because hunger never did either. Carpenters, masons and roofers worked with tools that looked like medieval torture devices and often behaved like them. They spent long days climbing, lifting, sawing, chiselling, measuring, and pretending not to notice when buildings leaned suspiciously. Cobblers repaired shoes worn down by the city's unforgiving streets. They stitched leather, shaped soles, and endured customers who didn't understand the limits of footwear surviving mud, stones, weather, and questionable life choices. Chandlers made candles, a deceptively delicate craft involving fire, boiling fat, and a tolerance for burns that bordered on heroic. Fishmongers, butchers, brewers, metal workers, barrel makers, rope makers, dyers, scribes, each filled a niche in the urban ecosystem. The city was a machine built from labour, and every worker was one of its gears. Apprentices. the unpaid workforce with hope. Every trade relied on apprentices, young workers whose job description included everything except dignity. Apprentices swept floors, fetched tools, carried goods, ran errands, cleaned workshops, obeyed orders, learned the craft, scrubbed equipment, and did whatever the master didn't feel like doing that day. Their workday started when the master called their name and ended when the master stopped calling their name. Apprenticeship was education by immersion. Full immersion, like being dunked underwater until you either learned to swim or became a cautionary tale. Labour schedules, written by someone who hated rest. The medieval concept of work hours can best be summed up as, you work until you can't. There were no 8-hour shifts, no weekends, no holidays besides the church calendar, which offered occasional relief but also demanded extra work preparing for festivals. Work began at first light, paused, briefly for meals that were eaten with the desperation of people who understood the value of chewing quickly, and continued until sunset, or later, if candles, energy, or desperation lasted that long. When darkness fell, labourers trudged home like people who had personally offended gravity. Muscles ached, hands blistered, clothes carried the story of the day in stains, smudges and burns. But tomorrow waited, promising more of the same. Urban workers and the physical economy. A medieval city required strength, not athletic strength, functional strength, the kind earned through daily repetition of tasks that pushed the body to its absolute limits. Workers lifted sacks, barrels, crates, baskets, and materials so routinely that weight felt like a permanent companion. They climbed ladders worn smooth, walked miles on uneven ground, swung heavy tools, carried infants, carried goods, carried burdens, and occasionally carried co-workers who discovered the limits of exhaustion the hard way. And it did. Medieval work didn't build fitness, it devoured it. Nutrition barely kept pace with exertion, and the human body adapted by becoming durable in ways modern gym enthusiasts can only dream of, and breaking down in ways modern medicine is deeply relieved to have avoided. Workshops as social worlds. The workplace wasn't just a place, it was a universe. Workers shared stories, jokes, curses, prayers, arguments, dreams, and the occasional loaf of bread smuggled in by someone whose wife baked better than yours. Masters taught techniques passed down through generations. Journeymen practiced skills until their fingers memorized them. Apprentices listened, watched, and learned, all while sweeping the floor for the 7th time that morning. These workshops formed the backbone of the city's identity. Each craft shaped the community. Each trade contributed to its stability. People didn't just work to survive. They worked to belong. A day's end. That wasn't really an end. When the workday finally ended, it didn't truly end. Tools needed cleaning. Materials needed storing. Workbenches needed resetting for tomorrow. At home, chores waited. Chopping wood, fetching water, preparing supper, mending clothes. Rest wasn't a state. It was a brief pause between responsibilities. Yet medieval workers endured. They took pride in their craft. They found camaraderie in shared struggle. They recognized that their labour sustained the city, kept trade alive, and provided meaning in a world where survival required purpose. If medieval work was the body of the city, guilds were the nervous system, coordinating, regulating, arguing, improving, restricting, organising, and occasionally strangling every craft that gave the city its livelihood. A guild wasn't just a professional association, it was a family, a government, a school, a police force, a labour union, a marketing committee, and a social club, all squeezed into one institution determined to make sure no one did anything unexpected. You're protected from competition and from freedom. The purpose of a guild, according to guilds claimed they existed to uphold quality, protect workers, prevent fraud, regulate prices, maintain training standards, coordinate public works, negotiate with authorities, and ensure that no craftsman suddenly decided to reinvent the wheel, which frankly, some probably needed reminding about. In truth, guilds valued consistency above all. A city could not thrive if every shoemaker charged a different price, every baker used a different weight, every weaver invented new shapes of clothing that terrified customers, or every blacksmith experimented with nails that bent like cooked noodles. Guilds kept order, both economic and social. If you belonged to a guild, you had security. If you didn't, well, good luck selling your work without someone tapping your shoulder to ask why you weren't following regulations written before you were born. Membership has requirements. Many, many requirements. To join a guild as a full member, you did not simply show up and announce that you liked shoes, pots, metalwork, or fish. No, you began at the bottom as an apprentice, for years of low pay, long hours, sore muscles, and the indescribable joy of being ordered around by people who enjoyed reminding you that they outranked you. After apprenticeship came the journeyman stage, in which you travelled, perfected your craft, and worked for whoever would hire you. Journeymen were skilled but not yet independent. They couldn't run their own shop. They couldn't hire others, and they absolutely couldn't sell outside approved markets unless they wanted a polite but firm conversation with guild officials, or an impolite one with guild enforcers. Only after proving mastery, often by creating a masterpiece, an object meant to demonstrate exceptional skill, could you apply to become a master. Masters could run workshops, train apprentices, and participate in guild decisions, if approved. If not approved, well, you remained a journeyman forever. Guilds were picky. Regulation, the guild's favourite activity. Guilds regulated everything, and by everything, we mean everything. What you could make, how you made it, how much you could charge, what materials you must use, where you must buy those materials, how many workers you could employ, what hours your shop could operate, how wide your stall could be, how tall your sign could hang, which feast days required closing, which days required attending church, how many apprentices you were allowed to yell at guilds didn't believe in half measures. If a single shoemaker made boots 3 pennies cheaper, the guild saw chaos approaching. If a baker sold loaves slightly larger or smaller than regulation, the guild felt civilization wobbling. Stability mattered, so much so that anyone who threatened it, intentionally or not, found themselves invited to a disciplinary meeting. No medieval worker feared the wrath of kings or nobles nearly as much as the wrath of their guild. A noble might ruin your day, a guild could ruin your life. The price of protection. For all their restrictions, guilds offered undeniable advantages. Membership meant legal right to practice your craft, protection from outside competition, fixed prices that prevented undercutting training, that ensured quality a support network in times of hardship, advocacy before city authorities. A baker didn't have to fear a sudden wave of amateur bakers flooding the market with bargain loaves. A potter didn't have to worry about cheap imports undercutting them. Not that medieval supply chains were robust enough for widespread imports anyway. A weaver didn't have to compete with someone using experimental methods that might produce confusing or terrifying results. Guilds protected livelihoods. They stabilized commerce. They ensured that a city maintained reliable standards. But protection always came bundled with limitation. Meetings, meetings, meetings. Guilds loved meetings with the same enthusiasm modern people reserve for complaining about meetings. They met weekly, monthly, seasonally, and whenever anything happened that required collective deliberation, which was often. Meetings covered new policies, fines, apprenticeship approvals, masterpiece, evaluations, disputes between members and non-members, disputes between members and reality. Holiday planning meetings were long. They were loud. They were mandatory. Many craftsmen spent as many hours in guild halls as in their own workshops. The guild hall was a second home, one in which no one was allowed to relax. Guild enforcement. Gentle in theory, firm in practice. Guilds had officers whose job was to inspect workshops, measure goods, test quality, verify materials, and make sure no one was secretly doing the unthinkable, innovating. These inspectors were part police, part judges, and part inconveniences who showed up exactly when you hoped they wouldn't. If you broke rules, punishment ranged from fines to temporary suspension to expulsion. Economic death in a medieval city. Guilds as community. Despite their rigid structure, guilds provided community. Members celebrated feast days, sponsored religious festivals, marched in parades, performed charitable works, supported widows and orphans, arranged funerals, and upheld traditions that connected generations. Guild identity was a source of pride. Belonging meant stability. Belonging meant reliability. Belonging meant you had people who would stand with you when misfortune struck. Guilds were restrictive, controlling, occasionally exhausting, but they were also anchors in a fragile world. They kept the city functioning. They kept trades alive. They kept workers united, even while limiting their freedom. Because in a medieval city, independence was risky. But a guild would keep you safe. Safe from competition, safe from chaos, and safe from trying anything too new. If you lived in a medieval city, you probably worked constantly, but you did not necessarily see much money. Coins did not flow through your hands so much as evaporate the moment they appeared. Most people survived in a constant balancing act where wages were small, needs were large, and the economy felt like a cosmic joke played entirely at your expense. Coins were rare guests. Coins existed, of course. Silver pennies, half-pennies, farthings, and the occasional larger denomination for people with suspiciously good fortune. But for the average labourer, coins were not familiar companions. They were exotic, elusive creatures that briefly visited your palm before migrating to someone else's purse. Urban wages were modest, often paid daily or weekly depending on your trade. A mason, a carpenter, or a skilled craftsman might earn a fair amount, while labourers, apprentices, and service workers earned barely enough to keep themselves fed. Women's wages were even lower, even when performing the same work. The economy played favourites, and most people were not on speaking terms with it. Your coins often vanished the moment you earned them. Rent, food, firewood, clothing repairs, guild dues, taxes, church tithes, unexpected expenses, and the occasional indulgence all demanded their share. You didn't save money, you circulated it, and quickly. Barter, the invisible currency. Because coins were scarce, barter thrived. Trade in medieval cities operated on networks of favours, exchanges and negotiations rather than pure currency. Want bread but short on coins. Offer eggs. Need your shoes fixed but can't pay. Promise a morning of labour in the cobbler's shop. Need herbs, trade cloth scraps or a repaired tool. The market didn't care how money changed hands. It only cared that the exchange happened. Barter wasn't informal, it was essential. People survived because they knew what they could offer. Housewives traded leftovers for services, labourers exchanged time for goods, craftsmen swapped materials, and everyone, absolutely everyone, kept mental ledgers of who owed what. Forgetting a favour could cause more trouble than forgetting rent. Barter's flexibility kept the city alive. It also meant no one had an accurate idea of what anything truly cost. Wages, earned with effort, lost with efficiency. Whatever little coin you earned wasn't just spent, it was hunted. Landlords wanted rent, bakers wanted payment, alehouses wanted their due, and their regulars rarely argued. Even guilds expected dues, fees, and contributions to communal feasts or charitable functions. Money didn't merely leave your hands quickly, it left with ambition. You earn money, other people see it, and other people included. The landlord, the tax collector, the church, the guild, the market vendors, the alehouse, the neighbour who insists you owe them a halfpenny from 2 months ago. Everyone knew when you got paid. Everyone knew when wages circulated. Medieval cities were dense, talkative ecosystems where privacy was about as real as unicorns. If you earned a better wage than usual, the rumour reached your landlord before you even got home. Debt, the unavoidable companion. Debt wasn't shameful, it was normal. Most urban families lived one bad week away from borrowing. A sick child, a rotten batch of grain, a broken tool, a missed work day. Any disruption sent families into a spiral of favours and repayments. But medieval debt had layers. Neighbourly debt, informal, interest-free, and remembered for decades. Artisan debt, borrowing tools, materials, or work time. Merchant debt, buying goods now, paying later, hoping your reputation was better than your purse. Moneylender debt, interest included, social judgment guaranteed. Moneylenders were essential but unpopular. They kept city economies functioning during shortages, but they also had a reputation for remembering every coin owed with supernatural clarity. Avoiding debt collectors required stealth, creativity, or excellent sprinting ability. Household management, an Olympic event. Stretching wages was a daily challenge. Housewives became masters of resourcefulness. They planned meals around what was affordable, not what was desirable. They repaired clothes until fabric itself begged for retirement. They rationed candles, stretched ale, recycled leftovers into new dishes, and managed every coin as if it were carved from precious metal. Children worked as soon as possible, running errands, assisting parents, apprenticing early, or taking odd jobs to contribute financially. Every extra penny mattered. Wealth was visible, poverty even more so. In medieval cities, wealth advertised itself. Larger houses, better clothes, more varied diets, servants, and the luxury of choice. Poverty advertised itself too. Patched garments, thin boots, small meals, debts owed, and the constant pressure of survival. Most people lived in the vast, middle, poor by modern standards but functional by medieval ones. They earned enough to live, rarely enough to rest, and never enough to stop worrying. Trust networks as currency. Because money was so scarce, medieval citizens relied heavily on trust. A baker extended credit because he knew your family. A carpenter repaired your roof because he remembered the time you brought him leftover stew. A brewer poured ale on credit because he trusted your reputation. Trust was wealth. Reputation was collateral. Honour was currency. Lose one, and your finances collapsed faster than a poorly built house. Coins, symbols more than tools. Coins mattered, but identity mattered more. To be a reliable member of the community meant more than coins in a purse. It meant you paid your debts eventually. It meant your word could be trusted. It meant people believed your family would make good on its obligations. In a world where money rarely stayed long enough to gather dust, character held more weight than silver. The reality of medieval urban life. People survived financially not because they were wealthy, but because they participated in a web of exchanges that distributed hardship evenly. The economy was a network built on necessity, generosity, obligation, and endurance. Money passed briefly through your hands like a guest who visited only long enough to grab a bite before running out the door again. You earned money. Other people saw it. And then, somehow, you lived another day. If you asked a medieval city dweller whether their home had laws, they would answer with absolute confidence, yes. If you asked whether those laws were followed, they would hesitate. If you asked whether those laws were applied fairly, they would laugh, cough, look over their shoulder, and change the subject. Urban justice existed, certainly, but it behaved like an actor, bold when observed, inconsistent when unsupervised, and always ready to improvise. The law is firm, the interpretation is flexible. Justice as a stage performance urban courts were public affairs. They did not take place behind closed doors, but in open halls, marketplaces, or guild buildings, where citizens gathered to watch. Justice was not merely delivered, it was performed. Accusers, defendants, witnesses, officers, judges, clerks, bailiffs, and curious onlookers all played roles in a spectacle equal parts legal trial and street theatre. The fact that half the crowd came to be entertained did not escape anyone. Medieval courts leaned into the drama. Officers announced charges loudly. Judges lectured dramatically. Defendants pleaded emotionally. Witnesses swore oaths with theatrical solemnity. And the audience whispered evaluations like seasoned critics. Trials weren't always long. Many were shockingly fast, with verdicts delivered before a defendant even understood what rhetorical trap they had walked into. Other cases dragged on for hours, fueled by personal grudges, procedural confusion, or judges who deeply enjoyed hearing themselves speak. The law on paper versus the law in practice. Urban charters, bylaws, regulations, guild codes, royal decrees, and church mandates formed a complex legal tapestry. On paper, everything had structure. Theft had penalties. Assault had punishments. Fraud was condemned. Market rules outlined fair pricing. Curfew violations were regulated. Public behaviour was policed. But laws in a medieval city were like well-meaning parents, strict in writing, negotiable in execution. Punishments varied not only by crime but by person, time, reputation, mood of the judge, presence of witnesses, and whether a respected guildmaster happened to be standing nearby. For example, a known troublemaker caught stealing might be fined heavily. A respected craftsman caught stealing the same item might receive a warning. A noble caught stealing might insist it was a misunderstanding and walk away untouched. A guard catching any of them might charge a fee simply for his time. Consistency was admired in theory but rarely practiced. Who was watching? The deciding factor. Urban law enforcement depended heavily on observation. If no one saw your wrongdoing, the court had no case. If someone did see it, the outcome depended on who they were. A wealthy merchant's accusation carried substantial weight. A guildmaster's accusation was practically a conviction. Meanwhile, a labourer accusing a wealthy citizen faced an uphill battle, requiring evidence, support, and perhaps divine intervention. Witness testimony mattered, but not equally. The credibility of a witness aligned directly with their social standing and reputation. A respected matron saying, "I saw him pick the lock," was persuasive. A vagrant saying, "I saw him summon demons," was politely ignored. The law wasn't blind. It had favourites, opinions, and selective attention. Punishments, public, creative, and designed to make a point. Medieval cities valued deterrence, not subtlety. Once a verdict was reached, punishment was often administered publicly so everyone could learn an extremely uncomfortable lesson. Common punishments included fines, universally hated but endlessly used, pillory or stocks, where the criminal became a temporary tourist attraction, whipping, brisk, painful, and very popular with local authorities, temporary exile, a punishment that doubled as a vacation with worse accommodations, public shaming, simple, effective, and deeply humiliating. Execution certainly existed, but cities preferred punishments that maintained order without losing a taxpayer. Even punishments became theatrical. Crowds gathered, vendors sold snacks, children stared, adults whispered. Criminals stood uncomfortably still and wished they were anywhere else. Urban justice did not happen quietly. The people behind the law. No system of justice survives without people ensuring it functions, more or less. Medieval cities relied on a small ecosystem of legal professionals, bailiffs, who enforced order and escorted prisoners, sergeants, who acted like officers with the enthusiasm of tax collectors, notaries, who documented everything as if writing would magically prevent future disputes, judges, who interpreted the law, sometimes correctly, sheriffs, in larger cities, who handled royal authority and pretended not to be exhausted. These officials were not perfect. Some were fair, some were corrupt, some were competent, some were catastrophically bored. All played roles in a legal network stretched thin across city life. Appeals, the hopeful fantasy. Appeal to a higher court was technically possible, but the higher the authority, the slower the process. A dispute over debt might reach a town justice in minutes, but take months or years if escalated to a baron, bishop or royal court. Most people accepted local decisions, partly because appealing required money, patience, and the optimism of a saint. Law as a tool and a weapon. Urban law was used not only for justice but for competition. Guilds used it to restrict rivals. Merchants used it to settle disputes. Landlords used it to remove troublesome tenants. Families used it to negotiate inheritance. Even neighbours used it to complain about noise, boundaries, or the mysterious disappearance of someone's best chicken. The law could protect you, but it could just as easily corner you. Navigating urban justice required skill, connections, and an awareness of who might be watching at any moment. Justice as performance. Even when fair, urban law had an element of performance. Judges wanted to appear strong. Guilds wanted to appear unified. Authorities wanted the city to believe order was in control, even when chaos lingered under every wooden beam and crooked street. So sentences were declared loudly. Cases were argued dramatically. Courts operated publicly. Justice wasn't just delivered, it was displayed. Because in a medieval city the law was firm, but the interpretation flexible, enough to bend around whoever happened to be watching. Crime in a medieval city didn't lurk in shadows. It mingled casually with the public. It brushed past you in the marketplace, stood beside you at the alehouse, followed you down narrow streets, and occasionally gave you a polite nod before picking your pocket. Urban density created something dangerous and liberating: anonymity. In a village, everyone knew your face, your family, and your poorly kept secrets. In a city, you were just another person in an endless moving crowd, and so was every thief. If you get robbed, at least you weren't stabbed. Probably. Theft, the city's most popular hobby. Theft thrived in crowded spaces where bodies pressed together and attention drifted. Markets were prime hunting grounds. Pickpockets, called cut purses, moved through the crowd with a grace that would impress professional dancers. They handled purses, belts and bags with such delicate skill that many victims didn't realize their loss until much later, often during the exact moment they needed money most. Cut purses worked quickly, spot a distracted target, slice the purse string with a small knife, let the purse fall into their palm, disappear into the crowd before the victim sneezed. It was an art form, a dangerous one, yes, but elegant in its efficiency. Other thieves specialized in burglary, breaking into homes, shops, or workshops during the night. Locks existed, but they were primitive. Doors were often wooden and old, and medieval buildings had structural quirks that amounted to passive encouragement. Loose shutters, bowed beams, holes where walls decided not to meet floors, and windows that could be opened by aggressive breezes. Still, burglars preferred homes where people were asleep rather than away. A sleeping family made less noise than a suspicious neighbour watching you haul furniture into the street. Scams. Creative crimes for creative criminals. Stealing goods wasn't the only method of acquiring wealth. Medieval scammers roamed the city with confidence and imagination. Common scams included false weights and measures, merchants who swore their scale was accurate while it gently lied, bad coin exchange, money changers slipping in clipped coins or foreign currency no one wanted, fake goods, selling counterfeit spices, watered-down wine, or metalwork that bent like warm cheese. The disappearing craftsman, taking payment up front and vanishing before the job began. The miracle cure peddler, offering potions that healed everything except the buyer's remorse. Some scams were small and daily. Others were ambitious operations requiring teams, planning, and the sort of daring confidence typically reserved for nobles and toddlers. Violence, unpleasant, frequent, and public cities were magnets for conflict. With so many people, tensions rose easily over debts, insults, business disputes, drunken bravado, or sheer boredom. Most violence was spontaneous. Fistfights outside taverns, brawls between rival apprentices, scuffles in alleys, and heated arguments that escalated when one party decided talking was overrated. Weapons weren't rare. Knives were tools before they were weapons, and everyone carried tools. Swords were common among guards and men who wanted to look important. Clubs, staffs, stones, bottles, and anything heavy enough to swing all appeared when tempers flared. Yet even violence had unwritten rules. People didn't want to kill. They wanted to win. Murder invited legal consequences. Fighting invited gossip. And nobody feared gossip like medieval city folk. But violence didn't always announce itself. City streets grew quiet at night, and quiet could be dangerous. Darkness hid movement, and anonymity emboldened cowards. Travellers after curfew walked with a mix of confidence, prayer, and brisk speed. If you made it home without trouble, it was a good night. If you got robbed, well, at least you weren't stabbed. Probably. The crowd. Shield and predator crowds were both protector and threat. In a city, blending in required only two things: movement and normal behaviour. Thieves took advantage of this constantly. In a tight crowd, a hand slipped into your purse. The man behind you looks innocent. Someone bumped you hard. Could have been anyone. You turned suddenly and saw someone running. They might be hurrying to market or hurrying away from your money. Crowds swallowed criminals whole. Guards chasing a thief often lost track the moment the criminal dashed through a bustling square. Ironically, this same anonymity protected honest citizens too. Once you disappeared into the market or ducked into a tavern, grudges became harder to pursue. The city wasn't just a hiding place for thieves, it was a refuge for anyone who needed to disappear for an hour, a day, or a lifetime. Criminal networks, not organised, but organised enough. While medieval cities didn't have sophisticated mafias, they did have loose networks of criminals who shared information, divided territory, and warned each other when authorities tightened control. Taverns served as their meeting places, alleys served as their offices, markets served as their primary hunting grounds. These groups weren't always loyal, but they understood the value of coordination. Too many cuts in the same purse string and guards would increase patrols. Too many burglaries in one neighbourhood, and the residents would form watch groups eager to test their new clubs. Balance was essential. Crime thrived, but subtly. Authorities, committed, overworked, and occasionally outnumbered city guards attempted to maintain order, but they faced three major challenges: too much crime, too many people, too much city. A guard patrolled a few streets and hoped nothing bad happened elsewhere. When they caught criminals, it was usually through luck, noise, or someone tripping over their own getaway plan. Guards played defense, criminals played everywhere. Living with crime citizens adapted as people always do. They guarded purses carefully. They travelled in groups at night. They learned which alleys to avoid. They trusted neighbours more than strangers. They saved their sharpest instincts for markets. And they developed an attitude that combined caution with resignation. Yes, crime was constant. Yes, thieves moved like ghosts in broad daylight. Yes, scams flourished like weeds, but the city was alive, vibrant, and worth the risk. Because in a medieval city, danger blended into the crowd, and the crowd was everywhere. If you got robbed, at least you weren't stabbed. Probably. In a medieval city, disease wasn't an occasional visitor. It was a tenant, a long-term tenant. The kind who moved in uninvited, refused to pay rent, made noise at all hours, and insisted on bringing friends. No one asked, "Am I sick?" The real question was, how sick? because sickness existed on a sliding scale ranging from mild inconvenience to start writing your will, illness as a daily companion. From the moment you woke up, your body held a negotiation with the microbial universe. If your throat felt a little sore, you shrugged. Everyone sounded like they'd swallowed gravel. If your stomach churned, well, so did everyone else's. If you had a fever, you wrapped yourself tighter and went to work anyway, because missing a day's wages meant missing a meal. Coughing was so common that it wasn't considered a symptom. It was considered atmosphere. And no matter how tough you were, you lived with the awareness that your body was not entirely under your control. The city pushed limits, and so did the diseases that thrived in it. Where sickness lurked, illness hid in every corner of the urban landscape. It drifted in the air, floated in the water, settled on surfaces, clung to clothing, and emanated from the very streets people walked on. You inhaled other people's breath constantly. You touched objects, touched by 1,000 hands. You lived in close quarters with family, neighbours, apprentices, guests, strangers, animals, and the occasional rat who behaved like a long-time resident. Crowding made disease a social event. When one person fell sick, the entire household followed. When a neighbour sniffled, the entire street prepared itself mentally. When a cough echoed from the house next door, you simply sighed, adjusted expectations for the week, and hoped for the best. Even minor illnesses were constant companions. Fevers, rashes, migraines, stomach ailments, joint pains, infections, and the mysterious category known as maladies that covered everything from fatigue to existential dread. Childhood, a medical obstacle course. Children bore the greatest share of daily illness. Their bodies were small, their immune systems constantly under siege, and their environments filled with hazards. Fevers, infections, parasites, stomach diseases, and seasonal plagues hit children with disproportionate force. Parents prayed, midwives worked tirelessly, neighbourhood women arrived with herbs, broths, compresses, charms, and an alarming willingness to apply remedies involving vinegar, smoke, or mysterious roots dug up at dawn. Every child who survived to adulthood was considered a miracle and sometimes treated like one. Epidemics. When illness got ambitious. Daily sickness was the background hum. Epidemics were the explosions. A medieval epidemic didn't arrive quietly. It announced itself like a messenger with terrible news, fast, loud, and widely discussed. Fevers swept through districts. Carts carried away the sick. Church bells tolled unanswered. The city's pace slowed, then staggered, then collapsed into fear. The wealthy fled first, packing bags, hiring carts, disappearing into country estates with enough room to breathe air that wasn't recycled by thousands of lungs. The poor stayed because they had nowhere else to go. Communal living turned contagion into wildfire. People prayed more fervently, whispered anxiously, avoided gatherings, or, contradictorily, crowded into churches seeking comfort and blessing. Medieval medicine could not stop an epidemic. What it could do was name it dramatically, misunderstand its cause creatively, and treat it enthusiastically with methods that felt more ceremonial than effective. Healing, hope with a pulse. When you fell ill, you sought help, but help varied wildly. Household remedies came first, herbs steeped in water, honey poured into everything, and broths that tasted far better when you were too sick to smell them. Families had recipes for every illness, passed down with pride and dubious accuracy. Wise women offered treatments rooted in experience and local knowledge. They knew which plants soothed fevers, which poultices comforted wounds, and which rituals calmed frightened patients. Physicians, if you could afford them, prescribed bleeding, purging, herbal concoctions, and stern advice, delivered with great confidence. Their treatments worked occasionally, mostly by accident. Barber surgeons handled the rest, pulling teeth, stitching wounds, setting broken bones, and performing procedures with tools that looked handmade. because they were. Healing was not a science. It was an attempt, fear, and acceptance. Despite the constant threat, medieval city dwellers lived with remarkable resilience. Illness was not an anomaly. It was a condition of existence. People developed a kind of emotional callus, a strength forged by necessity. You didn't panic when sickness appeared. You panicked only when it lingered. People accepted that bodies failed. They prayed for health, celebrated recovery, mourned loss, supported neighbours, and carried on. Life didn't pause for disease. It adapted around it. Still, the fear was real, especially when symptoms worsened. Nights were long when fevers burned. Days felt endless when weakness took hold. Families kept vigil, priests visited, and citizens walked a thin line between hope and surrender. Living with a permanent guest disease lived rent-free in every district of the city, above taverns, beside markets, behind workshops, inside homes that leaned or creaked or smelled faintly of herbs. It settled in quietly, stayed too long, and left when it pleased. The miracle wasn't that so many died. The miracle was that so many lived. Because medieval people were tough, resilient, adaptive, stubborn, and determined to carry on regardless of the bodily betrayals that visited them. In their world, the question was never, "Am I sick?" It was always, "How sick?" If disease lived rent-free in the medieval city, doctors were the well-meaning but underqualified landlords who tried, with great enthusiasm and very little scientific accuracy, to evict it. Medieval medicine wasn't practiced so much as attempted, a blend of inherited wisdom, guesswork, faith, astrology, ancient textbooks, and the unshakable confidence of someone applying leeches while insisting this was absolutely the correct course of action. The cure works spiritually, the rest is optional. The medical toolbox: hope, herbs, and hemorrhage. A medieval doctor's bag was less a collection of tools and more a travelling shrine to things people hoped healed them. Inside you might find herbs carefully chosen for their traditional uses, powders of mysterious origin, small vials of liquids that smelled like ambition, instruments for cutting, cauterizing, or extracting things, and of course, leeches, nature's most dedicated volunteers. Doctors worked with the best information available to them, which unfortunately came from ancient texts copied by monks, who sometimes added notes like, "This seems unlikely," in the margins. The foundational theory of medicine at the time was humorism, which insisted the body was controlled by 4 humours: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile. Illness, according to this logic, occurred when these humours were out of balance. The solution: restore balance by removing, adding, heating, cooling, drying, or moistening something inside you. Ideally the right thing, but the system never guaranteed that. It was treatment by vibes. Bleeding, the most popular mistake in Europe. If you visited a doctor with almost any ailment, fever, headache, melancholy, stomachache, mysterious lethargy, or simply an unfortunate vibe, he likely prescribed bloodletting, the universal medieval cure-all. Feeling weak? Let some blood out. Feeling faint? Let some blood out. Feeling feverish? Definitely let some blood out. Feeling like this treatment may not be helping? Don't worry, let some more out. Doctors believed blood was the most mischievous of the humours, and occasionally needed to be reminded who was boss. Leeches were favoured for more delicate bleeding. They quietly latched on, sipped enthusiastically, and fell off when full, medical interns of the natural world. Bloodletting occasionally, worked by accident, usually in cases where removing fluid temporarily eased symptoms, but its success rate was outweighed by everything else. Herbal remedies, sometimes miracles, sometimes misfires. Herbal knowledge was one area where medieval medicine occasionally shone. Healers used willow bark for pain, mint for digestive trouble, lavender for calming nerves, garlic for disinfecting wounds, honey for treating infection, rue, wormwood, sage, rosemary, nettle, fennel, and dozens more. Many of these plants actually had medicinal properties, though medieval practitioners didn't always understand their chemical actions. Herbs were often prescribed in mixtures so complicated they read like potions. 3 leaves of this, 1 pinch of that, crushed root, wine infused with vapour of something that may or may not be safe. Sometimes they helped, sometimes they did nothing, and sometimes they made you question the nature of your existence. Astrology. The stars have opinions about your liver. Medieval physicians often checked the sky before examining the patient. Astrology was considered an essential diagnostic tool. Why? Because the heavens controlled everything: tides, crops, fortunes, and apparently the state of your pancreas. Doctors consulted star charts to determine when to perform surgeries, when to prescribe medicines, when to bleed the patient, when to avoid certain body parts. Yes, really. If Mars was in the wrong house, your appointment had to be rescheduled. Not for the doctor's convenience, your spleen simply wasn't astrologically prepared. Surgeries, performed with courage, mostly yours. Surgery in the Middle Ages was a bold undertaking. Surgeons worked without anaesthesia, unless you count alcohol, prayer, fainting, or screaming quietly into a cloth. And yet medieval surgeons could accomplish remarkable things: setting broken bones, extracting arrowheads, sewing wounds, removing cysts, trepanning, drilling holes in skulls to relieve pressure. These procedures were performed with sterilization methods that range from lightly rinsed to wiped on apron. Survival was a combination of technique, luck, and the patient's refusal to die out of spite. Doctors versus barber surgeons, a turf war nobody won, a physician diagnosed, a barber surgeon cut, a wise woman healed, a herbalist treated, a priest prayed. Together they formed the chaotic medical avengers of medieval cities. Barber surgeons were practical. They cut hair, pulled teeth, lanced boils, stitched wounds, and sometimes amputated limbs. Physicians, meanwhile, preferred theoretical work like diagnosing humoral imbalances, prescribing diets, and telling you to avoid certain foods because Aristotle said so. They occasionally collaborated, but more often competed. A patient caught in the middle had to choose between scholarly theory or hands-on experience, both with equally unpredictable outcomes. Belief over biology. One reason medieval medicine persisted despite its flaws was that people believed deeply in its power. Healing was not just physical, it was emotional, spiritual, communal. Doctors offered confidence, wise women offered comfort, priests offered blessings, neighbours offered soup, and sometimes, miraculously, you got better. Not because the treatment was perfect, but because the body is stubborn, resilient, and occasionally indifferent to human error. Illness solved, sort of when treatments worked, doctors celebrated. When they didn't, humours were blamed, or the stars, or diet, or demons. Medical accountability was flexible, but citizens didn't expect perfection. They expected effort. A doctor who tried, even clumsily, was better than no doctor at all. Medieval medicine was messy, earnest, experimental, and wildly inconsistent. The cure worked spiritually. The rest was optional. In a medieval city, religion wasn't a once-a-week activity. It wasn't a private belief. It wasn't a side note to daily life. Religion was in the streets, between the streets, above the streets, and occasionally yelling from a bell tower. It shaped the calendar, the rhythm of the day, the architecture of the skyline, the behaviour of the citizens, and the moral commentary offered freely by neighbours. God was everywhere, especially watching. A city built around faith. You could not walk 5 minutes without passing something holy, or something trying very hard to look holy. Churches dotted the city in every direction, from towering cathedrals that dominated the skyline to tiny roadside chapels tucked between leaning houses. Each church had its own personality. Some were grand stone monuments to architectural ambition. Some were humble wooden structures with more draft than wall. Some leaned so precariously you suspected divine intervention was the only thing keeping them upright. No matter their size, they radiated authority. The church wasn't just a religious centre, it was a community centre, courthouse, shelter, meeting, space, and moral compass with its own gravitational pull. Bells that controlled your entire existence. The sound of bells governed city life with the precision of an omnipresent and slightly bossy clock. Bells rang for morning prayer, midday prayer, evening prayer, mass, weddings, funerals, feast days, market openings, market closings, announcements, warnings, and, occasionally, because someone in the belfry felt enthusiastic. When bells rang, you listened. They told you when to work, when to rest, when to pray, and when something somewhere had gone very wrong. Even if you weren't particularly devout, the bells demanded your attention, and they got it. Rituals woven into daily life. Faith wasn't an event, it was an atmosphere. Medieval citizens lived in a world where small rituals shaped every moment. Crossing oneself when passing a church, whispering a prayer before meals, lighting candles for protection, avoiding certain actions on holy days, blessing objects, animals, and occasionally children, who stood still long enough the religious calendar was crowded. Saints' days, feast days, vigils, fasts, processions, celebrations. There were so many holy occasions that the distinction between ordinary and sacred blurred. Life was a liturgical parade in which every week something needed commemorating. These rituals provided structure in a world lacking much formal organisation. When the city felt chaotic, religion offered predictable rhythm. Priests, equal parts. Shepherd and social anchor priests were some of the busiest individuals in the city. They performed baptisms, marriages, funerals, weekly sermons, confessions, blessings, disputes, whether they wanted to or not, moral reminders, whether you wanted them to or not. People turned to priests for guidance, comfort, advice, judgment, and occasionally gossip disguised as spiritual concern. Priests knew everyone's business, not intentionally, but because everyone brought their business straight to the confessional. Priests were not only religious figures, they were community organisers before the term existed. Churches as social spaces. Despite their solemn purpose, churches were vibrant hubs of social life. People gathered before and after services to talk, trade news, resolve arguments, or simply observe the fashion decisions of their fellow citizens. Church steps hosted meetings, conversations, deals, reunions, and the ancient art of casually judging one's neighbours. The holy and the human coexisted in a delightful blend of devotion and mild pettiness. Inside, churches offered something the city desperately lacked: quiet, peace, stillness, cool air, candles flickering in orderly rows. Even the least religious citizens found themselves pausing inside, letting the noise of the world fall away. Public morality, a shared responsibility. Morality wasn't only enforced by priests, it was enforced by everyone. Neighbours monitored each other's behaviour with enthusiastic vigilance. If someone skipped mass, the neighbourhood noticed. If someone failed to observe a fast day, whispers followed. If someone lived suspiciously well despite their income, well, perhaps they needed a gentle reminder about humility. Religion wasn't merely faith, it was identity, social glue, cultural expectation, and public accountability. Relics, pilgrimages, and holy tourism. Every city hoped to claim a religious relic: bones of a saint, a piece of a cross, a vial of holy dust that looked suspiciously like regular dust. If the relic was important enough, pilgrims came from far and wide, bringing money, prestige, and a renewed sense of purpose. Pilgrimages were the medieval version of both tourism and spiritual insurance. Cities with relics leaned into the role, building shrines, expanding churches, and occasionally embellishing the story of how, exactly, the relic arrived. God worked in mysterious ways. City economies worked in predictable ones. Faith as comfort in a harsh world life in a medieval city was difficult. Disease, danger, uncertainty, hardship. Faith provided meaning. Rituals gave order. Churches offered stability when the world did not. People prayed not just from obligation, but because prayer felt like a conversation with hope. Religion shaped how people saw the world. Illness had purpose. Fortune had meaning. Death had promise. Suffering had explanation. Community had foundation. Faith helped people endure what they could not control. But also, God is watching religion comforted, but it also supervised. Citizens lived with the unshakable awareness that God, the saints, angels, ancestors, and the entire celestial bureaucracy were observing with keen interest. You might sneak a little, cheat a little, or act foolishly at times, but there was always a sense of being watched, not just by neighbours, not just by priests, by God himself, everywhere, always, especially watching. Religion permeated medieval urban life, not because people feared punishment, but because it offered a story, a structure, and a presence in a world filled with unpredictability. And if you needed guidance, reassurance, or forgiveness, you knew exactly where to go, probably within 5 steps of wherever you were standing. Medieval cities worked hard, but they also played hard, loudly, enthusiastically, and with a level of risk modern people would politely decline. Entertainment wasn't a luxury, it was a necessity. After endless days of labour, crowds, and stress, the city needed release. And release came in forms that blended joy, chaos, and danger with a seamlessness only the Middle Ages could achieve. Fun is mandatory, safety is negotiable. Festivals, organised chaos with music. Festivals were the high points of the urban calendar. They marked religious feast days, seasonal transitions, guild celebrations, harvest milestones, royal events, and the occasional excuse the city invented simply because morale was low. A festival was a burst of colour, noise, food, drink, and unrestrained humanity. During these celebrations, the city reinvented itself. Streets filled with banners and garlands. Musicians roamed with fiddles, drums, pipes, and voices that ranged from angelic to "Please stop before the saints intervene." Dancers spun in circles, sometimes gracefully, sometimes like people who hadn't slept in several days. Performers appeared from nowhere. Jugglers, acrobats, fire-eaters, puppeteers, trained animals, storytellers with dramatic flair, and mimes who terrified small children. Allée flowed freely. Bread baskets multiplied like miracles, and people danced with neighbours, friends, and whoever happened to be within arm's reach. But festivals were not polished events. They were spontaneous, messy, and prone to mishap. A fire-eater might drop a spark, a juggler might misjudge gravity, a dancing circle might expand until it collided with a cart of apples. But nobody minded. Accidents made good stories, and medieval people cherished stories like treasure. Games that were fun until they weren't. City games range from delightful to dangerous, often within the same breath. Foot races were popular, though the uneven streets ensured that tripping was as common as running. Watching a group of adults sprint over cobblestones was thrilling and slightly terrifying, especially when the finish line doubled as a place someone had spilled grain earlier that morning. Wrestling drew large crowds. Contestants grappled in open squares while spectators yelled instructions, encouragement, or unsolicited tactical advice. Wrestling was friendly until it wasn't, and many matches ended with participants covered in dirt, pride wounded but spirits high. Archery contests showcased skill and discipline, or, if hosted near housing, showcased the durability of windows. Skilled archers dazzled crowds. Unskilled ones frightened them. Ball games were chaotic, especially the medieval version of football. which resembled a brawl with a ball occasionally, involved. Rules existed but were ignored. Participants pushed, shoved, tackled, collided and staggered through the streets in what looked less like a sport and more like a community attempt to rearrange the city's population. Some games teetered on the edge of absurdity. Log-lifting competitions tested strength. Rope-pulling matches tested teamwork. Animal-based games tested patience. And drinking contests tested everything. The fun of public punishment. Medieval entertainment was not always joyful. Sometimes it was moral instruction disguised as spectacle. Public punishments, pillory, stocks, whipping, fines read aloud, drew crowds with unsettling eagerness. These events weren't merely disciplinary. They were communal performances. People gathered to watch justice unfold, partly out of righteous civic duty, and partly because entertainment options were limited. Children sat on their parents' shoulders. Bakers paused kneading dough to peek outside. Merchants left stalls, briefly unattended to hear the charges. While grim, these spectacles unified the city. Citizens laughed at minor offences, gasped at harsher ones, and left feeling reassured that order had been restored, if only temporarily. For the punished, it was humiliation. For everyone else, it was Tuesday. Punishments were not intended to be pleasant. They were intended to be memorable, and the crowd ensured they were. Taverns, where leisure and risk mixed freely. When the festival ended, when the games concluded, when justice retreated indoors, entertainment continued in the taverns. Taverns were the social hearts of medieval cities, where people gathered for drink, music, gossip, argument, storytelling, and the occasional table-shoving disagreement. In a tavern, you could hear a bard sing tales of heroes and monsters, join dice games rigged by professionals, listen to travellers describe distant lands, witness apprentices drink more bravely than wisely, participate in arguments about whose guild was superior leave with fewer coins than you intended and fewer memories than you expected. Taverns were places of laughter and camaraderie, but also volatility. A spilled drink could start a fight. A good song could end one. A strong ale could land someone under a table. But people returned nightly because no place else offered such a delicious blend of relaxation and barely controlled chaos. Street performers, the unofficial guild. Performers were everywhere. Corners, squares, steps, tavern entrances, bridge crossings. They were city spice, unpredictable, lively, eccentric. You might encounter a storyteller weaving a tale so dramatic you dropped your bread, a musician creating beauty from an instrument missing several pieces, a dancing bear who obeyed commands reluctantly, a fire juggler who terrified every bystander, a troupe reenacting a heroic battle with questionable accuracy. Each performance was unique, partly because the performers were talented, and partly because accidents happened. Leisure with a side of danger. Everything in a medieval city had a risk factor. The city was a living organism, full of noise, unpredictability, and momentum. When people gathered for fun, they brought that momentum with them. Competitions got out of hand. Celebrations turned into scuffles. Performances ended with minor injuries. Public punishments bordered on theatrical horror. And yet, people cherished these moments. Leisure brought relief from hardship. It reminded citizens that life wasn't only work, illness, fear, and duty. It was also music, laughter, triumph, and shared experience. Medieval entertainment wasn't comfortable. It wasn't polished. It wasn't safe. Fun was mandatory. Safety was negotiable. In a medieval city, fire wasn't just a danger. It was an inevitability, a looming presence, a seasonal visitor, a force so woven into daily life that every citizen carried an unspoken understanding. Everything you own is flammable, including your optimism. Medieval people lived in wooden houses packed tightly along wooden streets filled with wooden carts near wooden workshops heated by open flames. It was a miracle cities lasted as long as they did. Your house is temporary. the ashes forever. A city built like kindling. To understand medieval fire anxiety, one must first appreciate the architecture. Houses built of timber frames stuffed with wattle, daub, and hope. Thatched roofs ready to ignite from a stray spark. Narrow streets that allowed flames to jump enthusiastically from one side to the other. Overhanging upper stories that formed cosy tunnels for fire to race through. The entire city was essentially a politely arranged bonfire waiting for a reason. Chimneys smoked constantly. Hearths burned day and night. Workshops relied on furnaces, forges, kilns, and candles. Taverns kept lamps burning late into the evening. Bakers woke before dawn to heat ovens so aggressively that neighbours occasionally mistook the glow for divine intervention. All it took was one mistake, one ember, one gust of wind full of bad intentions. The causes, human error, wind, and bad luck fires, began in countless small innocuous ways. A candle left too close to a curtain, a hearth log rolling unexpectedly, a lantern knocked over during a lively tavern debate, an oven overheated by an ambitious baker, a forge spark drifting lazily into dry timber. Even cooking posed risk. Medieval meals involved open flames, boiling cauldrons, and cooks juggling tasks in rooms that doubled as kitchens, dining areas, workshops, nurseries, and sometimes storage closets for firewood. Safety protocols were aspirational. But the greatest accomplice to fire was wind. Medieval cities were drafts of air trapped between wooden walls. One breeze could transform a minor spark into a sprinting inferno. Fire, fire. The worst alarm sound you could hear. When flames broke out, panic spread faster than the fire itself. Shouts tore through the streets. Bells rang, violently. Neighbours bolted from their homes, carrying children, tools, and whatever they could grab before heat claimed the rest. There was no fire department. There were only bucket chains, lines of citizens passing water hand to hand with frantic precision, hooks and poles to tear down burning structures before they spread, axes for desperate demolition, prayers for morale, divine mercy, or just a shift in wind direction. People fought fire together because no one fought it alone. A blaze that consumed one house could consume the entire city. Night fires. The nightmare. Scenario. The most terrifying fires struck at night, when streets were quiet and visibility low. Sleeping families woke to heat licking walls or smoke seeping under doors. By the time the alarm spread, the flames were already racing across rooftops. Night fires were deadly because darkness slowed evacuation. Buckets disappeared in the gloom. Neighbours struggled to coordinate. Sparks drifted unseen into new homes. Citizens slept with one ear open, not for burglars, but for the specific crackling sound that spelled doom. Firefighting techniques, half bravery, half improvisation. Medieval firefighting relied on bravery, coordination, and the willingness to destroy property to save the rest. Crews tore down walls, smashed roofs, and created fire breaks by sacrificing homes in the flames' path. If you were the unlucky target whose house was chosen as a barrier, the logic was simple. Better your house than everyone's. It was not a comforting motto. Water was scarce, equipment crude, and success never guaranteed. But the community fought with sheer determination, often saving more of the city than physics suggested possible. Aftermath. Ash, ruin, and quiet resolve. When flames finally died, dawn revealed a landscape of charred beams, collapsed roofs, smouldering piles, and stunned silence. Survivors walked streets that felt eerily unfamiliar, walls missing, landmarks gone, the air thick with smoke and grief. Yet medieval cities were resilient. Destruction led immediately to rebuilding. Ashes were cleared, timber was hauled, streets hummed with the noise of hammers, saws, and neighbours sharing tools. Rebuilding wasn't just construction, it was therapy. It proved that the city still lived. The cycle of rebirth. Medieval cities burned, then they rebuilt, then they burned again. Fire laws were drafted, revised, ignored, rediscovered, and revised again. Ban thatch roofs, limit wooden structures, store firewood away from homes, keep water barrels on hand, inspect hearths monthly. These rules were excellent on parchment and questionable in practice. People followed them until they didn't. Fire, patient and opportunistic, waited for the next lapse. The emotional toll. Living with constant fire risk shaped urban psychology. People valued durable possessions because so few items survived a blaze. They slept lightly. They reacted instantly to the smell of smoke. They learned to mentally separate what matters from what burns. Communities forged deep bonds through shared vulnerability. Neighbours relied on each other. Guilds supported victims. Churches opened their doors. Aid flowed from those who understood that tomorrow they might need the same help. Fire as the city's unwanted tradition. Every city had stories of past fires, spoken in hushed tones or retold dramatically at gatherings. The blaze that leapt across the market square. The inferno that consumed a whole district. The fire that burned for 3 days because wind refused to cooperate. Children grew up hearing these tales like cautionary bedtime stories. Your house was temporary, the ash was forever, living with fire. Medieval people didn't forget the threat, they simply coexisted with it. Fire was a shadow, a possibility, a reminder that life was fragile but community was strong. They built again, they hoped again, they lived again. In a city where everything could burn, what remained was resilience. When the sun dipped below the rooftops and shadows stretched into the alleys, the medieval city didn't simply get darker, it transformed. Daytime was loud, crowded, energetic and chaotic in a way that felt almost comforting. But nightfall turned the city into something quieter, sharper and far less forgiving. After dark, the city stops pretending. The curfew, a line drawn in time. Medieval cities enforced curfews with strict regularity. As twilight deepened, bells rang through the streets sending a clear message. Whatever you're doing, finish it now. Shops closed, workshops locked up, taverns dimmed lamps, market stalls folded, and citizens hurried home with the awareness of people who knew the darkness was not designed for them. Curfew wasn't merely a suggestion, it was law. Guards patrolled the city walls and main streets, ensuring no one wandered without permission or purpose. The streets after curfew belonged to officers, to their torches, and to whatever they happened to illuminate or miss entirely. Being caught outside without reason invited questioning, fines, or detention. Your explanation had better be convincing, something stronger than "I lost track of time" or "the tavern ale was unusually persuasive." The curfew was about order, control, and minimizing danger. It acknowledged the truth the city whispered every night. Daylight tamed the streets. Darkness unmasked them. Darkness that was truly dark. Modern darkness is softened by lamps, headlights, neon signs, and screens. Medieval darkness was absolute. Once the last candles were snuffed and hearths banked, the city fell into a blackness so complete it felt like a blanket thrown over the world. Streets disappeared. Landmarks faded. Even familiar corners became uncertain terrain. Doors were bolted, windows shuttered. People moved by touch more than sight, feeling their way along walls or counting steps from home to stable, from stable to bed. Movements practiced until they became muscle memory. Every creak echoed, every whisper travelled, every distant sound, an owl, a footfall, a dog growling at shadows, felt amplified by the absence of light. Danger in the dark, nighttime danger wasn't a rumour, it was a daily certainty. With fewer people outside, fewer eyes to witness, and fewer guards than the city truly needed, the streets belonged to risks that daylight kept at bay. Thieves preferred the night. Darkness made identification difficult, escape routes multiplied, and sound, so revealing during the day, became harder to trace in the confusing acoustics of empty streets. There were other dangers too. Drunken brawls stumbling out of taverns just before closing, animals wandering without supervision, fire hazards emerging quietly from embers left too close to flammable walls, drifters and strangers who moved silently in the dark, desperate souls who used night as cover to commit acts daylight wouldn't tolerate. Respectable citizens avoided travel after dark. Even those who considered themselves brave travelled with lanterns, companions, and a quiet prayer for safe passage. Night didn't create danger, it revealed it. Sounds that carried differently. Daytime noise was dense, layered, overlapping. Nighttime sound was sparse and magnified. A distant door closing could jolt awake an entire household. A footstep outside felt like an announcement. A whispered conversation seeped through wooden walls. Guards' torches crackled audibly. A dog's bark echoed through empty streets as though shouting into a cavern. Silence wasn't peaceful. It was watchful. People listened at night in ways they never did during the day. Homes as fortresses. When night fell, people withdrew indoors as if retreating behind battlements. Homes became protective shells. Doors reinforced, shutters latched, candles out. Families gathered close. Inside, the hearth glowed softly. Children whispered. Parents checked locks. Twice. A sense of vulnerability pressed against the walls from outside, making even the smallest cottage feel like a sanctuary. Domestic routines took on an urgency. Secure pets. Rake coals safely. Bolt doors. Store tools. Count everyone. Blow out every candle. Night transformed the home from shelter to fortress. The taverns before closing taverns offered one last burst of light and noise before darkness claimed the city. Patrons lingered as long as they dared, enjoying warmth, company, ale, and the illusion that night wasn't creeping closer. But once curfew neared, tavern keepers pushed people out with the practiced authority of someone who understood exactly what the night demanded. Stumbling home late was a negotiation with fate, and tavern keepers wanted no part in that deal. Midnight, a city holding its breath. By midnight, the city felt suspended, alive but unmoving. Fires crackled behind closed doors. Guards walked measured routes. Cats prowled like night's ambassadors. The wind slipped through alleys, rattling shutters and stirring loose straw. The city waited, breathed, rested, and beneath its rest lay tension, a knowledge that daylight's order had momentarily lost its grip. Night workers, the quiet few. Not everyone slept. Some professions thrived at night. Bakers woke early, kneading dough for morning bread. Watchmen patrolled with lanterns and stern expressions. Midwives responded to urgent knocks in the dark. Carters and traders passing through might arrive at the gates long before dawn. These night workers moved carefully, aware of the silence around them, grateful for torches and alert to every shifting shadow. Dawn. When the city exhaled. As the first hint of light brushed the rooftops, night loosened its grip. Birds stirred, doors creaked open, merchants emerged sleepily. The city woke with cautious optimism. Day reclaimed what night had changed. Order returned, familiarity resurfaced. But medieval citizens never forgot the truth. The city had two faces. Daytime pretended everything was stable, predictable, civilized. After dark, the city stopped pretending. It revealed what lay beneath: fear, mystery, danger, quiet resilience, and the fragile threads that held the community together until morning returned. A medieval city wasn't just a place, it was a tribe with walls. Inside those walls lived people who shared accents, customs, rhythms and assumptions so deeply ingrained they barely noticed them. And then one day, someone new walked through the gate. Maybe they spoke differently, maybe they dressed differently, Maybe they looked like they came from a place where houses didn't lean like tired drunks. Whatever the reason, the city noticed. Different isn't illegal, it's just alarming. The city that knew itself too well. In cities where generations lived, worked, and occasionally argued within the same cramped streets, citizens recognized each other by sight, voice, behavior, and even stride. The baker's son walked with purpose. The tanner's apprentice sprinted everywhere because he was always late. The alewife's laugh echoed 3 blocks. So when a stranger appeared, someone who didn't fit the pattern, people reacted as though a puzzle piece had wandered in from an entirely different box. Whispers spread quickly. Who is he? Where is she from? Does that accent sound foreign? Is that coat allowed? Suspicion wasn't always hostile, but it was always awake. Gates, where curiosity met caution. City gates functioned as checkpoints long before passports existed. Gatekeepers questioned newcomers, asked their intentions, checked goods, and mentally assessed risk. Their job was less about law enforcement and more about reading faces. Questions varied, but the tone rarely did. What brings you here? How long are you staying? Who can vouch for you? And why do you smell like you've travelled 15 miles with goats? Migrants seeking work often endured the most scrutiny. Cities depended on migrants. They provided labour, skills, trade connections, and sometimes fresh gossip. But dependence didn't erase suspicion. Foreigners altered the city's social balance, and medieval people worried about balance the way a tightrope walker worries about breezes. Accents as crime evidence. A different accent was the fastest route to being labelled an outsider. Even regional accents could trigger curiosity or mistrust. Someone from the next river valley might as well have arrived from the moon. People didn't need evidence of wrongdoing. They needed evidence of not belonging. Accent provided that instantly. Where are you from? Wasn't a polite question. It was a diagnostic tool. If your answer wasn't local, follow-up questions multiplied. Jobs. Nobody wanted. Filled by outsiders. Ironically, the city relied heavily on newcomers to fill roles locals avoided. Hard labour in construction. Dangerous river transport. Unpleasant. Jobs like butchering or tanning, carrying goods up and down steep streets, night watch in undesirable districts, working with strangers, animals, children, or chaos. Cities feared outsiders, yet could not function without them. That contradiction pulsed at the heart of urban life. Outsiders had skills locals lacked. Metalworkers, masons, merchants, scribes, healers, musicians, translators, or craftspeople trained in techniques unfamiliar to the city. Innovation often arrived wearing the clothes of someone unfamiliar, and the city struggled to decide whether to thank them or avoid them. Mistrust and myth-making. When medieval cities lacked information about a group, they filled the gaps with imagination. Myths flourished. People from that region secretly worship the moon. Their bread rises wrong. They speak to animals. They don't get sick the same way we do. Their knives are always sharper. Rumours created caricatures faster than truth could erase them. Outsiders lived in the shadow of these stories, navigating suspicion that felt both ancient and freshly invented. Guilds and the closed-door problem. Urban guilds guarded membership fiercely. To be accepted, one needed sponsorship, reputation, and time, not qualities outsiders arrived with. A foreign-born craftsman faced additional challenges. Locals undercut their prices. Guild members questioned their training. Masters refused to take them as apprentices. Citizens distrusted unfamiliar techniques. Some outsiders formed enclaves, streets or neighbourhoods populated by people from similar origins. This brought comfort, community, and shared culture, but also intensified suspicion from locals who interpreted clustering as secrecy. Religion and ritual as filters. Shared faith eased suspicion. Different faith magnified it. Cities were deeply religious, and religious difference felt threatening. Even minor variations in ritual, how someone prayed, crossed themselves, observed fasts, celebrated holidays, became markers of difference. People watched closely. People commented quietly. Outsiders did not have to do anything wrong. They simply had to do something differently. Markets, where tension mixed with opportunity. Markets were the rare places where outsiders were welcomed quickly, if they brought something new or useful to sell. Exotic fabrics, welcome. Strange spices, welcome cautiously. Foreign tools, welcome but inspected thoroughly. New ideas, welcome. But only if the guild approved, the clergy tolerated, and no one felt economically threatened. Market squares became mingling grounds where curiosity softened suspicion, at least temporarily. For a moment, difference felt exciting rather than alarming. Fear of the new, a civic reflex. Cities feared new foods, new techniques, new voices, new customs, new neighbours, new anything. Change threatened stability. Stability was the city's self-image, a precarious one considering half the buildings leaned like they were contemplating collapse. When strangers brought unfamiliar ways, locals reacted like people handed a mysterious object, fascinated and wary, hopeful and distrustful. Not hostility, instability. Suspicion often wasn't cruelty. It was insecurity. Medieval cities balanced on razor-thin margins of survival, limited resources, fragile health, tight housing, rigid hierarchies, unpredictable dangers. Anything unfamiliar risked tipping that balance. Fear of outsiders was ultimately fear of disruption. But time changed everything. Most outsiders, once established, slowly blended in. They married locals, learned the dialect, joined the church choir, paid taxes, always a fast route to acceptance. Raised children who knew no other home. Within a generation, yesterday's strangers became tomorrow's citizens, but the cycle persisted. Each new arrival restarted the ritual of suspicion, adjustment, assimilation, and acceptance. Different wasn't illegal, it was just alarming, until it wasn't. And in a medieval city always hungry for labour, skills and stories, outsiders kept arriving, and the city kept changing, one wary glance at a time. In a medieval city, childhood was not an era, it was an intermission, a small, fragile pause between being born and being useful. Children were loved, cherished, scolded, prayed over, and occasionally chased out of the kitchen with a broom, but they were not protected from responsibility. Life moved quickly, and children were expected to catch up. Childhood exists, it's just brief. A world built for adults, entered by children. From the moment they could walk without toppling into a stew pot, medieval children were integrated into the machinery of urban life. They watched adults constantly, how they worked, bargained, cooked, cleaned, carried, mended, lifted, and occasionally muttered about taxes. Observation became apprenticeship long before anyone called it that. Toys existed, but they were often made from discarded objects. Wooden hoop, a carved figure, a bundle of rags tied into a doll. Children played in the narrow streets, dodging carts, animals, and adults who believed streets were not for play, but for everything else. Games were squeezed between errands, chores, and whatever work the family demanded that day. A child didn't step into the adult world at a particular age. They slid into it gradually, nudged by necessity. Work, the great teacher. By age 7, or earlier, depending on desperation, children were expected to contribute. Work wasn't optional, it was the foundation upon which the household survived. Common tasks for city children included fetching water from the nearest well, running errands for parents, neighbours or employers, watching younger siblings, carrying firewood or coal, sorting grain, wool, herbs or scraps, cleaning tools and workshops, delivering messages across town, helping with food prep, laundry or market stalls. Children worked in ways scaled to their size, but never their age. No one asked, "Are you ready?" They asked, "Can you reach it?" And if the answer was yes, congratulations, you had a job. Apprenticeship, childhood's early exit. Apprenticeship was the medieval child's graduation from casual labour to structured labour. Around ages 10 to 14, children were formally bound to a master craftsman. This was not simply employment, it was relocation, education, discipline, and transformation all at once. An apprentice exchanged years of service for training in a trade. Meals and lodging were included, though lodging often meant a straw mattress in a corner of the workshop, and meals meant whatever the master's household scraped together. Apprenticeship involved long hours, strict rules, endless sweeping, endless fetching, endless repetition, occasional actual craft instruction. It was hard, exhausting, and crucial. Apprenticeship gave a child identity, status, and hope for future independence, even if it meant sacrificing youth to the workshop floor. School, a luxury with books and discipline. Some city children attended school, usually boys, occasionally girls, often depending on family wealth, ambition, or the availability of a monastery willing to tolerate noise. Schools focused on reading, writing, Latin memorization, religious instruction. More memorization discipline, mostly the physical kind. School was not a break from work. It was work, mental, demanding, and overseen by teachers who believed the rod was the most persuasive teaching tool invented. Most children learned numeracy and practical skills at home or in shops. School offered prestige but not escape. Play, moments borrowed from responsibility. Despite the pressure of work, children carved out slivers of leisure wherever they could. Their games were quick, noisy, simple, and adaptable to the unpredictable geography of medieval streets. They played tag, stick and ball games, hide and seek, pebble tossing, singing rhymes, racing over uneven, cobblestones, balancing on beams they absolutely should not climb. Play was impulsive, squeezed into the minutes between tasks. It restored energy before the next responsibility called them back. Danger, childhood's uninvited companion. Medieval childhood was filled with hazards adults took for granted. Open hearths, sharp tools, horses that did not slow down, streets that changed texture hourly, wells without full fencing, workshops with heavy equipment, rooftops used as convenient shortcuts, rivers that flowed faster than expected, diseases that lingered in the air. Parents watched children, but not constantly. The city watched them too, which was comforting until you realized the city's definition of safe was astonishingly flexible. Children learned caution early, or they didn't learn it at all. Family expectations, small shoulders, big duties. Households relied on children to bridge gaps adults couldn't fill. A child carried messages while parents worked. A child soothed siblings while adults negotiated. A child fetched water so dinner could be made. A child stood at a market stall so the mother could knead dough. Love and duty were intertwined. Parents did not work children to exhaustion out of cruelty. They did it out of necessity. In a fragile urban economy, every hand mattered, and children knew it. Growing up before growing tall. By adolescence, most city children had adult responsibilities. They controlled parts of the household economy, managed errands with efficiency, bargained in markets, apprenticed full-time, or earned wages through labour. Some girls worked as servants, some boys became journeymen, some children, especially those orphaned, entered the labour force with a speed that shocked even their own neighbours. Childhood wasn't absent. It was simply short, overshadowed by the demands of survival. Resilience learned. Early medieval children were tough, not by choice, but by environment. They adapted to noise, crowding, illness work, weather expectations, the unpredictable rhythm of a chaotic city. And they grew into adults who remembered childhood fondly, not because it was carefree, but because it was the one time life expected slightly less of them. Childhood existed, it just didn't linger. In a medieval city, children grew up quickly, not because they wanted to, but because the world around them refused to wait. Growing old in a medieval city was not a journey toward rest. It was a slow negotiation with a world that refused to pause for anyone. The city never slowed. Not for workers, not for children, and certainly not for the elderly. To grow old here was to remain part of the urban machinery long after the joints protested and the back issued daily complaints. In the medieval city, you didn't retire, you faded. Reaching old age, the first achievement. To become elderly in a medieval city was, itself, evidence of resilience, stubbornness, and perhaps divine favoritism. Disease, accidents, labour, fires, childbirth and unpredictable disasters removed many long before they reached their twilight years. Those who survived into their 50s, 60s or beyond were regarded with respect, awe and sometimes suspicion, because clearly these were people who had made several deals with fate. Old age brought recognition. Neighbours nodded more deferentially. Children listened, occasionally. Priests visited more often, sometimes out of care, sometimes out of preparation. But recognition was not rest. Work, the city's most persistent companion. In a medieval city there was no retirement. There were no pensions, no savings accounts, and no leisurely afternoons planned around hobbies. You worked as long as your body agreed, and when it disagreed, you negotiated. Elderly workers adapted by shifting into roles their bodies could manage. A former mason became a consultant on wall stability. The walls listened better than apprentices. A blacksmith's father filed tools instead of lifting iron. A weaver's mother spun thread after her fingers lost the precision for larger looms. A merchant's aging parent managed accounts rather than carrying goods. An elderly baker prepared dough while younger hands carried it to the ovens. Work simplified, but it never stopped. If you had a family, they absorbed you into lighter tasks. If you didn't, you worked until you physically couldn't, because the city did not forgive idleness. Even begging required effort. Early mornings, strategic positioning, relationship building, and constant navigation of weather, crowds, and municipal rules that changed depending on the mayor's mood. Physical decline, a slow unravelling the city, barely noticed. Old age brought frailty, aches, cloudy vision, stiff joints, and a collection of chronic ailments that medieval medicine offered little remedy for. Most elders lived with tooth loss, chewing became a memory, arthritis, movement required negotiation with every limb, hearing decline, became a personality trait. Weak legs, stairs were now personal enemies. Slowed reflexes, danger became more dangerous. The city, however, did not soften. Cobblestones remained uneven, streets remained crowded, stairs remained steep, doors remained low enough to hit a forehead that no longer ducked fast enough. Elders learned to navigate slowly, carefully, and strategically. They took the smoother streets, few though they were. They avoided rush hours. They clung to family members in busy markets so that a shove wouldn't topple them like an old shelf. Family as lifeline. The elderly who lived with family had the greatest security. Multi-generational households were common, partly because survival demanded collective effort, and partly because grandparents provided something valuable: wisdom, childcare, and supervision. In exchange, the younger generation provided food shelter, protection assistance with tasks requiring strength. Old age didn't remove responsibility, it shifted it. Elders often told stories to children, passed down skills, advised on disputes, remembered debts, preserved family reputation, and ensured that traditions continued. Their value was not rooted in productivity, but in continuity. Widowhood and vulnerability. Widowhood posed one of the greatest challenges. Widowed men often remarried quickly for practical reasons: household management, social stability, or economic advantage. Widowed women, especially without sons, faced harsher conditions. They could inherit property, but they also inherited risk. Widows relied on kinship networks, charity from neighbours, church assistance work that could be done at home, spinning, mending, nursing, brewing. The line between survival and hardship became razor thin. Community and church care. Although the city was harsh, it wasn't heartless. Communal charity existed, often organised through churches or guilds. Bread distributions, alms for the poor, charitable funds and occasional housing support helped. The most vulnerable elderly survive. Churches viewed care for the elderly as a moral duty. Guilds viewed it as a responsibility to members who had served a craft faithfully. Neighbours viewed it as common decency. Still, charity was supplemental, not sustaining. It helped, but it didn't replace family. Memory keepers and storytellers. Elders held the city's collective memory. They remembered fires, famines, rulers, uprisings, plagues, good years, terrible years, and all the small details younger generations overlooked. People sought them out for advice because experience was a currency no one else possessed. Grandparents became mediators in disputes, historians of the street, judges in family conflicts, and unofficial educators for children too restless for formal instruction. They preserved knowledge of old rituals, efficient work techniques, remedies learned from grandparents, lineages and alliances, mistakes no one wanted repeated. Their brains were libraries the city couldn't afford to lose. Public life shrinking. As aging advanced, elders withdrew from the bustling outer world into the quieter inner one. Their universe narrowed to the household, the workshop, the church, the doorway, the nearest bench, the familiar window through which they watched life move. They observed rather than participated. The city continued at its relentless pace. Elders drifted gently alongside its flow, slower but still present. Dignity in survival. Old age in a medieval city wasn't restful, but it carried dignity. To reach it meant you had endured everything the city could throw at you: disease, hunger, work, danger, cold, grief, and uncertainty. Your body faded, yes, but your presence mattered. Your wisdom mattered. Your endurance was proof of a life fiercely lived. You didn't retire. You faded, but slowly, stubbornly, and with the quiet pride of someone who had survived a city that never slowed down. Medieval cities were triumphs of humanity, alive, crowded, chaotic, inventive, filthy, vibrant, sacred, dangerous, industrious, and utterly unforgettable. They were places where opportunity and misery lived side by side, where faith rose above rooftops while sewage ran below them, and where every alleyway contained a mixture of ambition, fear, routine, and noise. To live in a medieval city was to participate in a grand experiment of survival and community. The good news? Millions lived full lives in medieval cities. The bad news? They did it by lowering their expectations. A life between extremes. Every day in a medieval city was a negotiation between hope and practicality. People found joy in simple victories: a loaf of bread well baked, a pot of ale flavoured just right, a festival that didn't end in injury, news that the fire in the next street had been contained, a child surviving a winter illness, a shipment of grain arriving on time, a workday that ended without a blister the size of moral regret. These weren't small things. They were everything. Life's pleasures had to be small because life's risks were enormous. Urban dwellers didn't expect comfort, predictability, or ease. They expected challenge, effort, and moments of relief scattered like breadcrumbs through the weeks. Lowering expectations wasn't pessimism, it was strategy. Hardship was not a surprise. It was a constant. Hardship didn't sneak up on medieval people, it lived with them. They woke to uncertainty. They worked through exhaustion. They ate what was available. They They endured disease, noise, conflict, crowding, and smells that modern noses would file complaints about. They lived among fires waiting to happen, strangers who might bring trouble, illnesses that spread faster than gossip, and infrastructure held together with wood, hope, and divine intervention. Every risk today felt like a memory tomorrow, and medieval citizens carried each memory carefully, adding it to the collective understanding of how to survive another year in a city made of ambition and hazard. The resilience that held everything together. Harsh conditions did not make medieval people fragile. They made them ingenious and resilient. City dwellers learned to adapt, rebuild, negotiate, endure, and, most miraculously, find joy anyway. They handled pressure with humour, patience, and a shared belief that life, despite everything, was worth showing up for. They found beauty where they could, sunlight slipping between leaning rooftops, bells echoing through morning fog, children laughing in a courtyard, candles glowing in a quiet chapel, ale shared after a long workday, music drifting from a festival long after curfew bells rang. Life wasn't easy, it wasn't clean, but it was full. Community, the invisible architecture. What truly sustained medieval cities wasn't stone or timber, it was the people holding each other up. Neighbours helped rebuild after fires. Guilds supported members in illness. Families absorbed widows, apprentices, and elderly parents. Churches fed the hungry. Markets connected everyone through exchange, dispute, and conversation. No one survived alone. Community softened the harsh edges. It made sorrow bearable and joy celebratory. It created continuity across generations, even when the city changed, burned, rebuilt, expanded, or shrank. If the physical city leaned and creaked, the social fabric held steady. Why they stayed with all its hardships? Why did people stay in medieval cities? Because the city offered something the countryside couldn't. Opportunity, diversity, profession, protection, identity, noise, culture, trade, and the electricity of human contact. Cities were engines of possibility. They were imperfect, dangerous, and exhausting, but they were alive in ways that made even suffering feel communal. People stayed because they belonged to the city as much as the city belonged to them. Expectation. Management, the greatest survival skill. Modern life teaches us to dream big, expect comfort, demand longevity, and pursue self-actualization. Medieval life taught the opposite. Expect difficulty, demand little, accept imperfection, and celebrate survival. Medieval expectations were not low from pessimism. They were low from realism. If the bread was edible, the day was good. If the streets didn't flood, it was excellent. If nobody in the household got sick, it was blessed. If a festival ended without fire damage, it was miraculous. If you lived long enough to complain about your knees, you were practically royalty. Happiness wasn't measured by abundance, it was measured by relief. The city was harsh, but life was meaningful. Make no mistake, medieval cities were punishing environments. They demanded everything: strength, patience, faith, endurance, adaptability, and a sense of humour sharp enough to withstand disappointment. But medieval people didn't just survive, they lived. They loved fiercely. They worked tirelessly. They celebrated loudly. They believed deeply. They raised children who ran through crooked streets and grew into adults who remembered them fondly. They built communities that persisted through fire, plague, violence, and hardship. Their lives were not defined by limitation. They were defined by persistence. The good news and the bad news. The good news? Millions lived full, meaningful lives in medieval cities. They built families, friendships, traditions, professions, and legacies inside walls that creaked and streets that never stopped moving. The bad news? They did it by lowering their expectations, way, way down, and then stepping over them with grit, humour, and stubborn hope. Medieval cities weren't comfortable, clean, or predictable, but they were human, raw, crowded, imperfect, determined, and endlessly alive.